Section 18 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 2. "Gordon, you stand in the door and keep your eye peeled," went on Blue. "Now, boys, listen. I've thought it all out. This game of man-hunting is the same to me as cattle raising is to you. And my life in Texas all comes back to me, I reckon, in good stead for us now. I'm going to kill Lee Jorth. Him first, and maybe his brothers. I had to think of a good many ways before I hit on one I reckon will be sure. It's got to be sure. Jorth has got to die. Well, here's my plan. That Jorth outfit is drinking some. We can gamble on it. They're not going to leave that store, and of course they'll be expecting us to start a fight. I reckon they'll look for some such siege as they held round Isbel's ranch. But we sure ain't going to do that. I'm going to surprise that outfit. There's only one man among them who is dangerous, and that's Queen. I know Queen, but he doesn't know me, and I'm going to finish my job before he gets acquainted with me. After that, all right?" Blue paused a moment, his eyes narrowing down, his whole face setting in a hard cast of intense preoccupation, as if he visualized a scene of extraordinary nature. "Well, what's your trick?" demanded Blaisdell. "You all know Greaves's store," continued Blue. "How them windows have wooden shutters that keep a light from showing outside. Well, I'm gambling that as soon as it's dark Jorth's gang will be celebrating. They'll be drinking, and they'll have a light, and the windows will be shut. They're not going to worry none about us. That store is like a fort. It won't burn. And sure, they'll never think of us charging them in there. Well, as soon as it's dark, we'll go round behind the lots and come up just across the road from Greaves's. I reckon we'd better leave Isbel where he lays till this fight's over. Maybe you'll have more and him to bury. We'll crawl behind them bushes in front of Coleman's yards. And here's where Jean comes in. He'll take an axe, and his guns, of course, and do some of his Injun sneaking round to the back of Greaves's store. And Jean, you must do a slick job of this, but I reckon it'll be easy for you. Back there it'll be dark as pitch for anyone looking out of the store, and I'm figuring you can take your time and crawl right up. Now, if you don't remember how Greaves's backyard looks, I'll tell you." Here Blue dropped on one knee to the floor, and with a finger he traced a map of Greaves's barn and fence, the back door and window, and especially a break in the stone foundation which led into a kind of cellar where Greaves stored wood and other things that could be left outdoors. "Jean, I take particular pains to show you where this hole is," said Blue, "because if the gang runs out you can duck in there and hide. And if they run out into the yard, well, you'll make it a sorry run for them. When you've crawled up close to Greaves's back door and waited long enough to see and listen, then you're to run fast and swing your axe smash against the window. Take a quick peep in if you want to. It might help. Then jump quick and take a swing at the door. You'll be standing to one side, so if the gang shoots through the door they won't hit you. Bang that door good and hard. Well, now's where I come in. When you swing that axe, I'll sure run to the front of the store. Jorth and his outfit will be some attentive to that pounding of yours on the back door, so I reckon, and they'll be looking that way. I'll run in, yell, and throw my guns on Jorth." "Humph! Is that all?" ejaculated Blaisdell. "I reckon that's all, and I'm figuring it's a hell of a lot," responded Blue, dryly. "That's what Jorth will think." "Where do we come in?" "Well, you all can back me up," replied Blue, dubiously. "You see, my plan goes as far as killing Jorth and maybe his brothers. Maybe I'll get a crack at Queen, but I'll be sure of Jorth. After that, all depends. Maybe it'll be easy for me to get out, and if I do you fellows will know it and can fill that storeroom full of bullets." "Well, Blue, with all respect to you, I sure don't like your plan," declared Blaisdell. "Success depends on too many little things, any one of which might go wrong." "Blaisdell, I reckon I know this here game better than you," replied Blue. "A gunfighter goes by instinct. This trick will work." "But suppose that front door of Greaves's store's barred," protested Blaisdell. "It hasn't got any bar," said Blue. "You shore?" "Yes, I reckon," replied Blue. "Hell, man, ain't you takin' a terrible chance?" queried Blaisdell. Blue's answer to that was a look that brought blood to Blaisdell's face. Only then did the rancher really comprehend how the little gunman had taken such desperate chances before and meant to take them now, not with any hope or assurance of escaping with his life, but to live up to his peculiar code of honor. "Blaisdell, did you ever hear of me in Texas?" he queried dryly. "Well, no, Blue. I can't swear I did," replied the rancher apologetically. "And Isbel was always sort of mysterious about his acquaintance with you." "My name's not Blue." "Ahuh! Well, what is it, then, if I'm safe to ask?" returned Blaisdell gruffly. "It's King Fisher," replied Blue. The shock that stiffened Blaisdell must have been communicated to the others. Jean certainly felt amaze, and some other emotion not fully realized, when he found himself face to face with one of the most notorious characters ever known in Texas, an outlaw long supposed to be dead. "Men, I reckon I'd kept my secret if I had any idea of coming out of this Isbel Jorth war alive," said Blue. "But I'm going to cash. I feel it here. Isbel was my friend. He saved me from being lynched in Texas. An' so I'm going to kill Jorth. Now I'll take it kind of y'u, if any of y'u come out of this alive, to tell who I was an' why I was on the Isbel side. Because this sheep an' cattle war, this talk of Jorth an' the Hash Knife Gang, it makes me sick. I know there's been crooked work on Isbel's side, too. An' I never want it on record that I killed Jorth because he was a rustler." "By God, Blue, it's late in the day for such talk," burst out Blaisdell in rage and amaze. "But I reckon you know what you're talking about. Well, I shore don't want to hear it." At this juncture Bill Isbel quietly entered the cabin, too late to hear any of Blue's statement. Jean was positive of that, for as Blue was speaking those last revealing words, Bill's heavy boots had resounded on the gravel path outside. Yet something in Bill's look, or in the way Blue averted his lean face, or in the entrance of Bill at that particular moment, all of these together seemed to Jean to add further mystery to the long secret causes leading up to the Jorth Isbel war. Did Bill know what Blue knew? Jean had an inkling that he did. And on the moment, so perplexing and bitter, Jean gazed out of the door, down the deserted road to where his dead father lay, white-haired and ghastly in the sunlight. "Blue, you could have kept that to yourself as well as your real name," interposed Jean with bitterness. "It's too late now for either to do any good. But I appreciate your friendship for Dad, and I'm ready to help carry out your plan." That decision of Jean's appeared to put an end to protest or argument from Blaisdell or any of the others. Blue's fleeting dark smile was one of satisfaction. Thereupon most of this group of men seemed to settle a grim restraint. They went out and walked and watched. They came in again, restless and somber. Jean thought that he must have bent his gaze 1,000 times down the road to the tragic figure of his father. That sight roused all emotions in his breast, and the one that stirred there most was pity. The pity of it, Gaston Isbel lying face down in the dust of the village street. Patches of blood showed on the back of his vest and one white-sleeved shoulder. He had been shot through. Every time Jean saw this blood he had to stifle a gathering of wild, savage impulses. Meanwhile the afternoon hours dragged by, and the village remained as if its inhabitants had abandoned it. Not even a dog showed on the side of the road. Jorth and some of his men came out in front of the store and sat on the steps in close convening groups. Every move they made seemed significant of their confidence and importance. About sunset they went back into the store, closing door and window shutters. Then Blaisdell called the Isbel faction to have food and drink. Jean felt no hunger, and Blue, who had kept apart from the others, showed no desire to eat. Neither did he smoke, though early in the day he had never been without a cigarette between his lips. Twilight fell and darkness came. Not a light showed anywhere in the blackness. "Well, I reckon it's about time," said Blue, and he led the way out of the cabin to the back of the lot. Jean strolled behind him, carrying his rifle and an axe. Silently the other men followed. Blue turned to the left and led through the field until he came within sight of a dark line of trees. "That's where the road turns off," he said to Jean. "And here's the back of Coleman's place. Well, Jean, good luck." Jean felt the grip of a steel-like hand, and in the darkness he caught the gleam of Blue's eyes. Jean had no response in words for the laconic Blue, but he wrung the hard, thin hand and hurried away in the darkness. Once alone, his part of the business at hand rushed him into eager, thrilling action. This was the sort of work he was fitted to do. In this instance it was important, but it seemed to him that Blue had coolly taken the perilous part. And this cowboy with gray in his thin hair was in reality the great King Fisher. Jean marveled at the fact, and he shivered all over for Jorth. In 10 minutes, 15 more or less, Jorth would lie gasping bloody froth and sinking down. Something in the dark, lonely, silent, oppressive summer night told Jean this. He strode on swiftly. Crossing the road at a run, he kept on over the ground he had traversed during the afternoon, and in a few moments he stood breathing hard at the edge of the common behind Greaves's store. A point of light penetrated the blackness. It made Jean's heart leap. The Jorth contingent were burning the big lamp that hung in the center of Greaves's store. Jean listened. Loud voices and coarse laughter sounded discord on the melancholy silence of the night. What Blue had called his instinct had surely guided him aright. Death of Gaston Isbel was being celebrated by revel. In a few moments Jean had regained his breath. Then all his faculties set intensely to the action at hand. He seemed to magnify his hearing and his sight. His movements made no sound. He gained the wagon, where he crouched a moment. The ground seemed a pale, obscure medium, hardly more real than the gloom above it. Through this gloom of night, which looked thick like a cloud but was really clear, shone the thin, bright point of light, accentuating the black square that was Greaves's store. Above this stood a gray line of tree foliage, and then the intensely dark blue sky studded with white, cold stars. A hound bayed lonesomely somewhere in the distance. Voices of men sounded more distinctly, some deep and low, others loud, unguarded, with a vacant note of thoughtlessness. Jean gathered all his forces until sense of sight and hearing were in exquisite accord with the suppleness and lightness of his movements. He glided on about 10 short, swift steps before he halted. That was as far as his piercing eyes could penetrate. If there had been a guard stationed outside the store, Jean would have seen him before being seen. He saw the fence, reached it, entered the yard, glided in the dense shadow of the barn until the black square began to loom gray, the color of stone at night. Jean peered through the obscurity. No dark figure of a man showed against that gray wall, only a black patch, which must be the hole in the foundation mentioned. A ray of light now streaked out from the little black window. To the right showed the wide black door. Farther on, Jean glided silently. Then he halted. There was no guard outside. Jean heard the clink of a cap, the lazy draw of a Texan, and then a strong, harsh voice. Jorth's. It strung Jean's whole being tight and vibrating. Inside he was on fire, while cold thrills rippled over his skin. It took tremendous effort of will to hold himself back another instant, to listen, to look, to feel, to make sure. And that instant charged him with a mighty current of hot blood, straining, throbbing, damning. When Jean leaped, this current burst. In a few swift bounds he gained his point halfway between the door and window. He leaned his rifle against the stone wall. Then he swung the axe. Crash! The window shutter split and rattled to the floor inside. The silence then broke with a hoarse, "What's that?" With all his might, Jean swung the heavy axe on the door. Smash! The lower half caved in and banged to the floor. Bright light flared out of the hole. "Look out!" yelled a man in loud alarm. "They're battering the back door." Jean swung again, high on the splintered door. Crash! Pieces flew inside. "They've got axes," hoarsely shouted another voice. "Shove the counter ag'in' the door." "No," thundered a voice of authority that denoted terror as well. "Let them come in. Pull your guns and take cover." "They ain't comin' in," was the hoarse reply. "They'll shoot in on us from the dark." "Put out the lamp," yelled another. Jean's third heavy swing caved in part of the upper half of the door. Shouts and curses intermingled with the sliding of benches across the floor and the hard shuffle of boots. This confusion seemed to be split and silenced by a piercing yell of different caliber, of terrible meaning. It stayed Jean's swing, caused him to drop the axe and snatch up his rifle. "Don't anybody move." Like a steel whip this voice cut the silence. It belonged to Blue. Jean swiftly bent to put his eye to a crack in the door. Most of those visible seemed to have frozen into unnatural positions. Jorth stood in front of his men, hatless and coatless, one arm outstretched, and his dark profile set toward a little man just inside the door. This man was Blue. Jean needed only one flashing look at Blue's face, at his leveled, quivering guns, to understand why he had chosen this trick. "Who are you?" demanded Jorth in husky pants. "Reckon I'm Isbel's right-hand man," came the biting reply. "Once tolerable well known in Texas. King Fisher." The name must have been a guarantee of death. Jorth recognized this outlaw and realized his own fate. In the lamplight his face turned a pale greenish white. His outstretched hand began to quiver down. Blue's left gun seemed to leap up and flash red and explode. Several heavy reports merged almost as one. Jorth's arms jerked limply, flinging his gun, and his body sagged in the middle. His hands fluttered like crippled wings and found their way to his abdomen. His death pale face never changed its set look nor position toward Blue, but his gasping utterance was one of horrible mortal fury and terror. Then he began to sway, still with that strange rigid set of his face toward his slayer, until he fell. His fall broke the spell. Even Blue, like the gunman he was, had paused to watch Jorth in his last mortal action. Jorth's followers began to draw and shoot. Jean saw Blue's return fire bring down a huge man who fell across Jorth's body. Then Jean, quick as the thought that actuated him, raised his rifle and shot at the big lamp. It burst in a flare. It crashed to the floor. Darkness followed, a blank, thick, enveloping mantle. Then red flashes of gun emphasized the blackness. Inside the store there broke loose a pandemonium of shots, yells, curses, and thudding boots. Jean shoved his rifle barrel inside the door, and holding it low down, he moved it to and fro while he worked lever and trigger until the magazine was empty. Then, drawing his six-shooter, he emptied that. A roar of rifles from the front of the store told Jean that his comrades had entered the fray. Bullets zipped through the door he had broken. Jean ran swiftly round the corner, taking care to sheer off a little to the left, and when he got clear of the building he saw a line of flashes in the middle of the road. Blaisdell and the others were firing into the door of the store. With nimble fingers Jean reloaded his rifle. Then swiftly he ran across the road and down to get behind his comrades. Their shooting had slackened. Jean saw dark forms coming his way. "Hello, Blaisdell," he cried warningly. "That you, Jean?" returned the rancher, looming up. "Well, we wasn't worried about you." "Blue?" queried Jean sharply. A little dark figure shuffled past Jean. "Howdy, Jean," said Blue dryly. "You shore did your part. Reckon I'll need to be tied up, but I ain't hurt much." "Colmor's hit," cried the voice of Gordon, a few yards distant. "Help me, somebody." Jean ran to help Gordon uphold the swaying Colmor. "Are you hurt bad?" asked Jean anxiously. The young man's head rolled and hung. He was breathing hard and did not reply. They almost had to carry him. "Come on, men," called Blaisdell, turning back toward the others who were still firing. "We'll let well enough alone. Fredericks, you and Bill help me find the body of the old man. It's here somewhere." Farther on down the road the searchers stumbled over Gaston Isbel. They picked him up and followed Jean and Gordon, who were supporting the wounded Colmor. Jean looked back to see Blue dragging himself along in the rear. It was too dark to see distinctly. Nevertheless, Jean got the impression that Blue was more severely wounded than he had claimed to be. The distance to Meeker's cabin was not far, but it took what Jean felt to be a long and anxious time to get there. Colmor apparently rallied somewhat. When this procession entered Meeker's yard, Blue was lagging behind. "Blue, how are you?" called Blaisdell with concern. "Wal, I got my boots on, anyhow," replied Blue, huskily. He lurched into the yard and slid down on the grass and stretched out. "Man, you're hurt bad," exclaimed Blaisdell. The others halted in their slow march and, as if by tacit, unspoken word, lowered the body of Isbel to the ground. Then Blaisdell knelt beside Blue. Jean left Colmor to Gordon and hurried to peer down into Blue's dim face. "No, I ain't hurt," said Blue, in a much weaker voice. "I'm just killed. It was Queen. You heard me. Queen was only a bad man in that lot. I knowed it. I could have killed him, but I was after Lee Jorth and his brothers." Blue's voice failed there. "Well," ejaculated Blaisdell. "Shore was funny, Jorth's face, when I said Kingfisher," whispered Blue. "Funnier when I bored him through. But it was Queen." His whisper died away. "Blue," called Blaisdell sharply. Receiving no answer, he bent lower in the starlight and placed a hand upon the man's breast. "Well, he's gone. I wonder if he really was the old Texas Kingfisher. No one would ever believe it. But if he killed the Jorths, I'll sure believe him." End of chapter 9, part 2. Section 19 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 1. 2 weeks of lonely solitude in the forest had worked incalculable change in Ellen Jorth. Late in June her father and her 2 uncles had packed and ridden off with Daggs, Colter, and 6 other men, all heavily armed, some somber with drink, others hard and grim with a foretaste of fight. Ellen had not been given any orders. Her father had forgotten to bid her good by or had avoided it. Their dark mission was stamped on their faces. They had gone, and, keen as had been Ellen's pang, nevertheless their departure was a relief. She had heard them bluster and brag so often that she had her doubts if any great Jorth Isbel wore. Barking dogs did not bite. Somebody, perhaps on each side, would be badly wounded, possibly killed, and then the feud would go on as before, mostly talk. Many of her former impressions had faded. Development had been so rapid and continuous in her that she could look back to a day-by-day transformation. At night she had hated the sight of herself, and when dawn came she would rise singing. Jorth had left Ellen at home with the Mexican woman and Antonio. Ellen saw them only at meal times, and often not then, for she frequently visited old John Sprague or came home late to do her own cooking. It was but a short distance up to Sprague's cabin, and since she had stopped riding the black horse, Spades, she walked. Spades was accustomed to having grain, and in the mornings he would come down to the ranch and whistle. Ellen had vowed she would never feed the horse and bade Antonio do it. But one morning Antonio was absent. She fed Spades herself. When she laid a hand on him, and when he rubbed his nose against her shoulder, she was not quite so sure she hated him. "Why should I?" she queried. "A horse can't help it if he belongs to..." Ellen was not sure of anything, except more and more it grew good to be alone. A whole day in the lonely forest passed swiftly, yet it left a feeling of long time. She lived by her thoughts. Always the morning was bright, sunny, sweet, and fragrant and colorful, and her mood was pensive, wistful, dreamy. And always, just as surely as the hours passed, thought intruded upon her happiness, and thought brought memory, and memory brought shame, and shame brought fight. Sunset after sunset she had dragged herself back to the ranch, sullen and sick and beaten. Yet she never ceased to struggle. The July storms came, and the forest floor, that had been so sere and brown and dry and dusty, changed as if by magic. The green grass shot up, the flowers bloomed, and along the canyons beds of lacy ferns swayed in the wind and bent their graceful tips over the amber-colored waters. Ellen haunted these cool dells, these pine-shaded, mossy-rocked ravines, where the brooks tinkled and the deer came down to drink. She wandered alone, but there grew to be company in the aspens and the music of the little waterfalls. If she could have lived in that solitude always, never returning to the ranch home that reminded her of her name, she could have forgotten and have been happy. She loved the storms. It was a dry country, and she had learned through years to welcome the creamy clouds that rolled from the southwest. They came sailing and clustering and darkening at last to form a great purple angry mass that appeared to lodge against the mountain rim and burst into dazzling streaks of lightning and gray palls of rain. Lightning seldom struck near the ranch, but up on the rim there was never a storm that did not splinter and crash some of the noble pines. During the storm season, sheep herders and woodsmen generally did not camp under the pines. Fear of lightning was inborn in the natives, but for Ellen the dazzling white streaks, or the tremendous splitting, crackling shock, or the thunderous boom and rumble along the battlements of the rim had no terrors. A storm eased her breast. Deep in her heart was a hidden gathering storm, and somehow to be out where the elements were warring, when the earth trembled and the heavens seemed to burst asunder, afforded her strange relief. The summer days became weeks, and farther they carried Ellen on the wings of solitude and loneliness until she seemed to look back years at the self she had hated. And always, when the dark memory impinged upon peace, she fought and fought until she seemed to be fighting hatred itself. Scorn of scorn and hate of hate, yet even her battles grew to be dreams. For when the inevitable retrospect brought back Jean Isbel and his love and her cowardly falsehood, she would shudder a little bit and put an unconscious hand to her breast and utterly fail in her fight and drift off down to vague and wistful dreams. The clean and healing forest, with its whispering wind and imperious solitude, had come between Ellen and the meaning of the squalid sheep ranch, with its travesty of home, its tragic owner, and it was coming between her two selves, the one that she had been forced to be and the other that she did not know, the thinker, the dreamer, the romancer, the one who lived in fancy the life she loved. The summer morning dawned that brought Ellen strange tidings. They must have been created in her sleep and now were realized in the glorious burst of golden sun, in the sweep of creamy clouds across the blue, in the solemn music of the wind in the pines, in the wild screech of the blue jays and the noble bugle of a stag. These heralded the day as no ordinary day. Something was going to happen to her. She divined it, she felt it, and she trembled. Nothing beautiful, hopeful, wonderful could ever happen to Ellen Jorth. She had been born to disaster, to suffer, to be forgotten and die alone. Yet all nature about her seemed a magnificent rebuke to her morbidness. The same spirit that came out there with the thick amber light was in her. She lived, and something in her was stronger than mind. Ellen went to the door of her cabin, where she flung out her arms, driven to embrace this nameless purport of the morning. And a well-known voice broke in upon her rapture. "Well, lass, I like to see you happy, and I hate myself for comin', because I've been to Grass Valley for 2 days, and I've got news." Old John Sprague stood there with a smile that did not hide a troubled look. "Oh, Uncle John, you startled me!" exclaimed Ellen, shocked back to reality. And slowly she added, "Grass Valley? News?" She put out an appealing hand, which Sprague quickly took in his own, as if to reassure her. "Yes, and not bad so far as you Jorths are concerned," he replied. "The first Jorth Isbel fight has come off. Reckon you remember making me promise to tell you if I heard anything? Well, I didn't wait for you to come up." So Ellen heard her voice calmly saying, "What was this lying calm when there seemed to be a stone hammer at her heart? The first fight. Not so bad for the Jorths? Then it had been bad for the Isbels." A sudden cold stillness fell upon her senses. "Let's sit down outdoors," Sprague was saying. "Nice and sunny this mornin'. I declare I'm out of breath, not used to walkin'. And besides, I left Grass Valley in the night and I'm tired. But excuse me for hangin' round that village last night. There were sure..." Who was killed?" interrupted Ellen, her voice breaking low and deep. "Guy Isbel and Bill Jacobs on the Isbel side, and Daggs, Craig, and Greaves on your father's side," stated Sprague, with something of awed haste. "Ah," breathed Ellen, and she relaxed to sink back against the cabin wall. Sprague seated himself on the log beside her, turning to face her, and he seemed burdened and grave with important matters. "I heard a good many conflicting stories," he said earnestly. "The village folks is all scared, and there's no believin' their gossip. But I got what happened straight from Jake Evarts. The fight come off day before yesterday. Your father's gang rode down to Isbel's ranch. Daggs was seen to be wanting some of the Isbel horses, so Evarts says, and Guy Isbel and Jacobs ran out in the pasture. Daggs and some others shot them down." "Killed them that way?" put in Ellen sharply. So Everett says he was on the ridge and swears he seen it all. They killed Guy and Jacobs in cold blood. No chance for their lives, not even to fight. Well, then they surrounded the Isbel cabin. The fight lasted all that day and all night and the next day. Everett says Guy and Jacobs laid out there all this time, and a herd of hogs broke in the pasture and was eating the dead bodies. "My God!" burst out Ellen. "Uncle John, you sure can't mean my father wouldn't stop fighting long enough to drive the hogs off and bury those dead men?" "Everett says they stopped fighting all right, but it was to watch the hogs," declared Sprague. "And then, what do you think? The women folks come out, the red-headed one, Guy's wife, and Jacob's wife. They drove the hogs away and buried their husbands right there in the pasture. Everett says he has seen the graves." "It is the women who can teach these bloody Texans a lesson," declared Ellen forcibly. "Well, Daggs was drunk, and he got up from behind where the gang was hiding and dared the Isbels to come out. They shot him to pieces, and that night some one of the Isbels shot Craig, who was alone on guard. And last, this here's what I come to tell you. Jean Isbel slipped up in the dark on Greaves and knifed him." "Why do you want to tell me that particularly?" asked Ellen slowly. "Because I reckon the facts in the case are queer, and because, Ellen, your name was mentioned," announced Sprague positively. "My name mentioned?" echoed Ellen. Her horror and disgust gave way to a quickening process of thought, a mounting astonishment. "By whom?" "Jean Isbel," replied Sprague, as if the name and the fact were momentous. Ellen sat still as a stone, her hands between her knees. Slowly she felt the blood recede from her face, pricking her kin down below her neck. That name locked her thought. "Ellen, it's a mighty queer story. Too queer to be a lie," went on Sprague. "Now you listen. Everett's got this from Ted Meeker, and Ted Meeker heard it from Greaves, who didn't die till the next day after Jean knifed him. And your dad shot Ted for telling what he heard. No, Greaves wasn't killed outright. He was cut something terrible in 2 places. They wrapped him all up, and next day packed him in a wagon back to Grass Valley. Everett says Ted Meeker was friendly with Greaves and went to see him as he was laying in his room next to the store. Well, according to Meeker's story, Greaves came to and talked. He said he was sitting there in the dark, shooting occasionally at Isbel's cabin, when he heard a rustling behind him in the grass. He knowed someone was crawling on him, but before he could get his gun around, he was jumped by what he thought was a grizzly bear. But it was a man, and he shut off Greaves' wind and dragged him back in the ditch. And he said, 'Greaves, it's the half-breed, and he's going to cut you, first for Ellen Jorth and then for Gaston Isbel.' Greaves said Jean ripped him with a bowie knife, and that was all Greaves remembered. He died soon after telling this story. He must have fought awful hard. The second cut Isbel gave him went clear through him. Some of the gang was there when Greaves talked, and naturally they wondered why Jean Isbel had said, 'First for Ellen Jorth.' Somebody remembered that Greaves had cast a slur on your good name, Ellen. And then they had Jean Isbel's reason for saying that to Greaves. It caused a lot of talk, and when Sim Bruce busted in, some of the gang haw-hawed him and said as how he'd get the third cut from Jean Isbel's bowie. Bruce was half drunk, and he began to cuss and rave about Jean Isbel being in love with his girl. As bad luck would have it, a couple of more fellas come in and asked Meeker questions. He just got to that part, Greaves, it's the half-breed, and he's going to cut you, first for Ellen Jorth, when in walked your father. Then it all had to come out, what Jean Isbel had said and done, and why. How grieves had back Sim Bruce in slurring you?" Sprague paused to look hard at Ellen. "Oh, then what did Dad do?" whispered Ellen. "He said, 'By God, half breed or not, there's one Isbel who's a man.' An' he killed Bruce on the spot an' gave Meeker a nasty wound. Somebody grabbed him before he could shoot Meeker again. They threw Meeker out an' he crawled to a neighbor's house where he was when Evarts seen him." Ellen felt Sprague's rough but kindly hand shaking her. "And now what do you think of Jean Isbel?" he queried. A great, unsurmountable wall seemed to obstruct Ellen's thought. It seemed gray in color. It moved toward her. It was inside her brain. "I tell you, Ellen Jorth," declared the old man, "that Jean Isbel loves you terribly, and he believes you're good." "Oh no, he doesn't," faltered Ellen. "Well, he jest does." "Oh, Uncle John, he can't believe that," she cried. "Of course he can. He does. You are good as gold, Ellen, and he knows it. What a queer deal it all is, poor devil, to love you that terribly and have to fight your people. Ellen, your dad had it correct. Isbel or not, he's a man. And I say what a shame you two are divided by hate. Hate that you had nothing to do with." Sprague patted her head and rose to go. "Maybe that fight will end the trouble. I reckon it will. Don't cross bridges till you come to them, Ellen. I must hurry back now. I didn't take time to unpack my burros. Come up soon. And say, Ellen, don't think hard any more of that Jean Isbel." End of chapter 10, part 1. Section 20 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 2. Sprague strode away, and Ellen neither heard nor saw him go. She sat perfectly motionless, yet had a strange sensation of being lifted by invisible and mighty power. It was like movement felt in a dream. She was being impelled upward when her body seemed immovable as stone. When her blood beat down this deadlock of her physical being and rushed on through her veins, it gave her an irresistible impulse to fly, to sail through space, to run and run and run. And on the moment the black horse, Spades, coming from the meadow, whinnied at sight of her. Ellen leaped up and ran swiftly, but her feet seemed to be stumbling. She hugged the horse and buried her hot face in his mane and clung to him. Then, just as violently, she rushed for her saddle and bridle and carried the heavy weight as easily as if it had been an empty sack. Throwing them upon him, she buckled and strapped with strong, eager hands. It never occurred to her that she was not dressed to ride. Up she flung herself, and the horse, sensing her spirit, plunged in the strong, free gait down the canyon trail. The ride, the action, the thrill, the sensations of violence were not all she needed. Solitude, the empty aisles of the forest, the far miles of lonely wilderness, were these the added all? Spades took a swinging, rhythmic lope up the winding trail. The wind fanned her hot face. The sting of whipping aspen branches was pleasant. A deep rumble of thunder shook the sultry air. Up beyond the green slope of the canyon massed the creamy clouds, shading darker and darker. Spades loped on the levels, leaped the washes, trotted over the rocky ground, and took to a walk up the long slope. Ellen dropped the reins over the pommel. Her hands could not stay set on anything. They pressed her breast and flew out to caress the white aspens and to tear at the maple leaves and gather the lavender juniper berries, and came back again to her heart. Her heart that was going to burst or break. As it had swelled, so now it labored. It could not keep pace with her needs. all that was physical, all that was living in her, had to be unleashed. Spades gained the level forest. How the great brown-green pines seemed to bend their lofty branches over her, protectively, understandingly. Patches of azure blue sky flashed between the trees. The great white clouds sailed along with her, and shafts of golden sunlight, flecked with gleams of falling pine needles, shone down through the canopy overhead. Away in front of her, up the slow heave of forest land, boomed the heavy thunderbolts along the battlements of the Rim. Was she riding to escape from herself? For no gait suited her until Spades was running hard and fast through the glades. Then the pressure of dry wind, the thick odor of pine, the flashes of brown and green and gold and blue, the soft, rhythmic thuds of hoofs, the feel of the powerful horse under her, the whip of spruce branches on her muscles contracting and expanding in hard action, all these sensations seemed to quell for the time the mounting cataclysm in her heart. The oak swales, the maple thickets, the aspen groves, the pine-shaded aisles, and the miles of silver spruce all sped by her, as if she had ridden the wind, and through the forest ahead shone the vast open of the Basin, gloomed by purple and silver cloud, shadowed by gray storm, and in the west brightened by golden sky. Straight to the Rim she had ridden, and to the point where she had watched Jean Isbel that unforgettable day. She rode to the promontory behind the pine thicket and beheld a scene which stayed her restless hands upon her heaving breast. The world of sky and cloud and earthly abyss seemed one of storm-sundered grandeur. The air was sultry and still, and smelled of the peculiar burnt wood odor caused by lightning striking trees. A few heavy drops of rain were pattering down from the thin gray edge of clouds overhead. To the east hung the storm, a black cloud lodged against the Rim, from which long misty veils of rain streamed down into the Gulf. The roar of rain sounded like the steady roar of the rapids of a river. Then a blue-white, piercingly bright, ragged streak of lightning shot down out of the black cloud. It struck with a splitting report that shocked the very wall of rock under Ellen. Then the heavens seemed to burst open with thundering crash and close with mighty thundering boom. Long roar and longer rumble rolled away to the eastward. The rain poured down in roaring cataracts. The south held a panorama of purple-shrouded range and canyon, canyon and range, on across the rolling leagues to the dim, lofty peaks, all canopied over with angry, dusky, low-drifting clouds, horizon-wide, smoky, and sulphurous. And as Ellen watched, hand pressed to her breast, feeling incalculable relief in sight of this tempest and gulf that resembled her soul, the sun burst out from behind the long bank of purple cloud in the west and flooded the world there with golden lightning. "It is for me," cried Ellen. "My mind, my heart, my very soul. Oh, I know now. I love him, love him, love him." She cried it out to the elements. "Oh, I love Jean Isbel, and my heart will burst or break." The might of her passion was like the blaze of the sun. Before it all else retreated, diminished. The suddenness of truth dimmed her sight, but she saw clearly enough to crawl into the pine thicket, through the clutching dry twigs, over the mats of fragrant needles, to the covert where she had once spied upon Jean Isbel. And here she lay face down for a while, hands clutching the needles, breast pressed hard upon the ground, stricken and spent. But vitality was exceedingly strong in her. It passed that weakness of realization, and she awakened to the consciousness of love. But in the beginning it was not consciousness of the man. It was new, sensorial life, elemental, primitive, a liberation of a million inherited instincts, quivering and physical, over which Ellen had no more control than she had over the glory of the sun. If she thought at all, it was of her need to be hidden, like an animal, low down near the earth, covered by green thicket, lost in the wildness of nature. She went to nature, unconsciously seeking a mother, and love was a birth from the depths of her, like a rushing spring of pure water long underground, and at last propelled to the surface by a convulsion. Ellen gradually lost her tense rigidity and relaxed. Her body softened. She rolled over until her face caught the lacy golden shadows cast by sun and bough. Scattered drops of rain pattered around her. The air was hot, and its odor was that of dry pine and spruce fragrance penetrated by brimstone from the lightning. The nest where she lay was warm and sweet. No eye, save that of nature, saw her in her abandonment. An ineffable and exquisite smile wreathed her lips, dreamy, sad, sensuous, the supremacy of unconscious happiness. Over her dark and eloquent eyes, as Ellen gazed upward, spread a luminous film, a veil. She was looking intensely, yet she did not see. The wilderness enveloped her with its secretive, elemental sheaths of rock, of tree, of cloud, of sunlight. Through her thrilling skin poured the multiple and nameless sensations of a living organism stirred to supreme sensitiveness. She could not lie still, but all her movements were gentle, involuntary. The slow reaching out of her hand to grasp at nothing visible was similar to the lazy stretching of her limbs, to the heave of her breast, to the ripple of muscle. Ellen knew not what she felt. To live that sublime hour was beyond thought. Such happiness was like the first dawn of the world to the sight of man. It had to do with bygone ages. Her heart, her blood, her flesh, her very bones were filled with instincts and emotions common to the race before intellect developed, when the savage lived only with his sensorial perceptions. Of all happiness, joy, bliss, rapture, to which man was heir, that of intense and exquisite preoccupation of the senses, unhindered and unburdened by thought, was the greatest. Ellen felt that which life meant with its inscrutable design. Love was the only realization of her mission on the earth. The dark storm cloud, with its white, ragged ropes of lightning and down-streaming gray veils of rain, the purple gulf rolling like a colored sea to the dim mountains, the glorious golden light of the sun, these had enchanted her eyes with her beauty of the universe. They had burst the windows of her blindness. When she crawled into the green brown covert, it was to escape too great perception. She needed to be encompassed by close, tangible things. And there her body paid the tribute to the realization of life, shock, convulsion, pain, relaxation, and then unutterable and insupportable sensing of her environment and the heart. In one way, she was a wild animal alone in the woods, forced into the mating that meant reproduction of its kind. In another, she was an infinitely higher being, shot through and through with the most resistless and mysterious transport that life could give to flesh. And when that spell slackened its hold, there wedged into her mind a consciousness of the man she loved, Jean Isbel. Then emotion and thought strove for mastery over her. It was not herself or love that she loved, but a living man. Suddenly he existed so clearly for her that she could see him, hear him, almost feel him. Her whole soul, her very life cried out to him for protection, for salvation, for love, for fulfillment. No denial, No doubt marred the white blaze of her realization. From the instant she had looked up into Jean Isbel's dark face she had loved him. Only she had not known. She bowed now, and bent, and humbly quivered under the mastery of something beyond her ken. Thought clung to the beginnings of her romance, to the 3 times she had seen him. Every look, every word, every act of his returned to her now in the light of the truth. Love at first sight? He had sworn it, bitterly, eloquently, scornful of her doubts. And now a blind, sweet, shuddering ecstasy swayed her. How weak and frail seemed her body! Too small, too slight, for this monstrous and terrible engine of fire and lightning and fury and glory. Her heart. It must burst or break. Relentlessly, memory pursued Ellen, and her thoughts whirled and emotion conquered her. At last she quivered up to her knees, as if lashed to action. It seemed that first kiss of Isbel's, cool and gentle and timid, was on her lips. And her eyes closed and hot tears welled from under her lids. Her groping hands found only the dead twigs and pine boughs of the trees. Had she reached out to clasp him? Then hard and violent on her mouth and cheek and neck burned those other kisses of Isbel's, and with the flashing, stinging memory came the truth that now she would have bartered her soul for them. Utterly she surrendered to the resistlessness of his love. Her loss of mother and friends, her wandering from one wild place to another, her lonely life among bold and rough men, had developed her for violent love. It overthrew all pride. It engendered humility. It killed hate. Ellen wiped the tears from her eyes, and as she knelt there she swept to her breast a fragrant, spreading bough of pine needles. "I'll go to him," she whispered. "I'll tell him of my love. I'll tell him to take me away, away to the end of the world, away from here, before it's too late." It was a solemn, beautiful moment, but the last spoken words lingered hauntingly. "Too late?" she whispered. And suddenly it seemed that death itself shuddered in her soul. Too late? It was too late. She had killed his love. That Jorth blood in her, that poisonous hate, had chosen the only way to strike this noble Isbel to the heart. Basely, with abandonment of womanhood, she had mockingly perjured her soul with a vile lie. She writhed. She shook under the whip of this inconceivable fact. Lost, lost. She wailed her misery. She might as well be what she had made Jean Isbel think she was. If she had been shamed before, she was now abased, degraded, lost in her own sight. And if she would given her soul for his kisses, she now would have killed herself to earn back his respect. Jean Isbel had given her at sight the deference she had unconsciously craved and the love that would have been her salvation. What a horrible mistake she had made of her life! Not her mother's blood, but her father's, the Jorth blood, had been her ruin. Again Ellen fell upon the soft pine needle mat, face down, and she groveled and burrowed there in an agony that could not bear the sense of light. All she had suffered was as nothing to this. To have awakened to a splendid and uplifting love for a man whom she had imagined she hated, who had fought for her name and had killed in revenge for the dishonor she had avowed. To have lost his love, and what was infinitely more precious to her now in her ignominy, his faith in her purity. This broke her heart. End of chapter 10, part 2. Section 21 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, part 1. When Ellen, utterly spent in body and mind, reached home that day, a melancholy, sultry twilight was falling. Fitful flares of sheet lightning swept across the dark horizon to the east. The cabins were deserted. Antonio and the Mexican woman were gone. The circumstances made Ellen wonder, but she was too tired and too sunken in spirit to think long about it, or to care. She fed and watered her horse and left him in the corral. Then, supperless, and without removing her clothes, she threw herself upon the bed and at once sank into heavy slumber. Sometime during the night she awoke. Coyotes were yelping, and from that sound she concluded it was near dawn. Her body ached, her mind seemed dull. Drowsily she was sinking into slumber again when she heard the rapid clip-clop of trotting horses. Startled, she raised her head to listen. The men were coming back. Relief and dread seemed to clear her stupor. The trotting horses stopped across the lane from her cabin, evidently at the corral where she had left Spades. She heard him whistle. From the sound of hoofs she judged the number of horses to be 6 or 8. Low voices of men mingled with thuds and cracking of straps and flopping of saddles on the ground. After that, the heavy tread of boots sounded on the porch of the cabin opposite. A door creaked on its hinges. Next, a slow footstep, accompanied by clinking spurs, approached Ellen's door, and a heavy hand banged upon it. She knew this person could not be her father. "Hello, Ellen?" She recognized the voice as belonging to Colter. Somehow its tone, or something about it, sent a little shiver down her spine. It acted like a revivifying current. Ellen lost her dragging lethargy. "Hey, Ellen, are you there?" added Colter, louder voice. "Yes, of course I'm here," she replied. "What do you want?" "Well, I'm sure glad you're home," he replied. "Antonio's gone with his squaw, and I was some worried about you." "Who's with you, Colter?" queried Ellen, sitting up. "Rock Wells and Springer. Tad Jorth was with us, but we had to leave him over here in a cabin." "What's the matter with him?" "Well, he's hurt tolerable bad," was the slow reply. Ellen heard Colter's spurs jangle, as if he had uneasily shifted his feet. "Where's Dad and Uncle Jackson?" asked Ellen. A silence, pregnant enough to augment Ellen's dread, finally broke to Colter's voice, somehow different. "Sure they're back on the trail, and we're to meet them where we left Tad." "Are you going away again?" "I reckon. And Ellen, you're going with us." "I am not," she retorted. "Well, you are if I have to pack you," he replied forcibly. "It's not safe here any more. That damned half-breed Isbel with his gang are on our trail." The name seemed like a red-hot blade at Ellen's leaden heart. She wanted to fling 100 queries on Colter, but she could not utter one. "Ellen, we've got to hit the trail and hide," continued Colter anxiously. "You mustn't stay here alone. Suppose them Isbels would trap you. They'd tear off your clothes and rope you to a tree. Ellen, sure you're going. You hear me?" "Yes, I'll go," she replied, as if forced. "Well, that's good," he said quickly, and rustled tolerable lively. "We've got to pack." The slow jangle of Colter's spurs and his slow steps moved away out of Ellen's hearing. Throwing off the blankets, she put her feet to the floor and sat there a moment staring at the blank nothingness of the cabin interior in the obscure gray of dawn. Cold, gray, dreary, obscure, like her life, her future. And she was compelled to do what was hateful to her. As a Jorth, she must take to the unfrequented trails and hide like a rabbit in the thickets. But the interest of the moment, a premonition of events to be, quickened her into action. Ellen unbarred the door and let in the light. Day was breaking, with an intense, clear, steely light in the east, through which the morning stars still shone white. A ruddy flare betokened the advent of the sun. Ellen unbraided her tangled hair and brushed and combed it. A queer, still pang came to her at sight of pine needles tangled in her brown locks. Then she washed her hands and face. Breakfast was a matter of considerable work, and she was hungry. The sun rose and changed the gray world of forest. For the first time in her life Ellen hated the golden brightness, the wonderful blue of sky, the scream of the eagles, and the screech of the jay, and the squirrels she had always loved to feed were neglected that morning. Colter came in. Ellen had never before looked attentively at him, or else he had changed. Her scrutiny of his lean, hard features accorded him more Texan attributes than formerly. His gray eyes were as light, as clear, as fierce as those of an eagle, and the sand gray of his face, the long, drooping, fair mustache, hid the secrets of his mind, but not its strength. The instant Ellen met his gaze she sensed a power in him that she instinctively opposed. Colter had not been so bold nor so rude as Daggs, but he was the same kind of man, perhaps the more dangerous for his secretiveness, his cool, waiting inscrutableness. "Mornin', Ellen," he drawled. "You shore look good for sore eyes." "Don't pay me compliments, Colter," replied Ellen. "And your eyes are not sore." "Wal, I'm sore, shore, from fightin' and ridin' and layin' out," he said, bluntly. "Tell me what happened," returned Ellen. "Girl, it's a tolerable long story," replied Colter. "And we've no time now. Wait till we get to camp." "Am I to pack my belongings or leave them here?" asked Ellen. "Reckon you'd better leave them here." "But if we did not come back?" "Wal, I reckon it's not likely we'll come soon," he said, rather evasively. "Colter, I'll not go off into the woods with just the clothes I have on my back." "Ellen, we've shore got to pack all the grab we can. This shore ain't going to be a visit to neighbors. We're shy of pack horses. But you make up a bundle of belongings you care for, and the things you'll need bad. We'll throw it on somewhere." Colter stalked away across the lane, and Ellen found herself dubiously staring at his tall figure. Was it the situation that struck her with a foreboding perplexity, or was it her intuition steeling her against this man? Ellen could not decide, but she had to go with him. Her prejudice was unreasonable at this portentous moment, and she could not yet feel that she was solely responsible to herself. When it came to making a small bundle of her belongings, she was in a quandary. She discarded this and put in that, and then reversed the order. Next in preciousness to her mother's things were the long hidden gifts of Jean Isbel. She could part with neither. While she was selecting and packing this bundle, Colter again entered and without speaking began to rummage in the corner where her father kept his possessions. This irritated Ellen. "What do you want there?" she demanded. "Wal, I reckon your dad wants his papers and the gold he left here and a change of clothes. Now, doesn't he?" returned Colter, coolly. "Of course. But I suppose you would have me pack them." Colter vouchsafed no reply to this, but deliberately went on rummaging with little regard for how he scattered things. Ellen turned her back on him. At length, when he left, she went to her father's corner and found that, as far as she was able to see, Colter had taken neither papers nor clothes, but only the gold. Perhaps, however, she had been mistaken, for she had not observed Colter's departure closely enough to know whether or not he carried a package. She missed only the gold. Her father's papers, old and musty, were scattered about, and these she gathered up to slip in her own bundle. Colter or one of the men had saddled Spades, and now he was tied to the corral fence, champing his bit and pounding the sand. Ellen wrapped bread and meat inside her coat, and after tying this behind her saddle she was ready to go. But evidently she would have to wait, and preferring to remain outdoors, she stayed by her horse. Presently, while watching the men pack, she noticed that Springer wore a bandage round his head under the brim of his sombrero. His motions were slow and lacked energy. Shuddering at the sight, Ellen refused to conjecture. All too soon she would learn what happened, and all too soon, perhaps, she herself would be in the midst of another fight. She watched the men. They were making a hurried, slipshod job of packing food supplies from both cabins. More than once she caught Colter's gray gleam of gaze on her, and she did not like it. "I'll ride up and say good bye to Sprague," she called to Colter. "Shore you won't do nothing of that kind," he called back. There was authority in his tone that angered Ellen, and something else which inhibited her anger. What was there about Colter with which she must reckon? The other two Texans laughed aloud, to be suddenly silenced by Colter's harsh and lowered curses. Ellen walked out of hearing and sat upon a log, where she remained until Colter hailed her. "Get up and ride," he called. Ellen complied with this order, and riding up behind the three mounted men, she soon found herself leaving what for years had been her home. Not once did she look back. She hoped she would never see the squalid, bare pretension of a ranch again. Colter and the other riders drove the pack horses across the meadow, off of the trails, and up the slope into the forest. Not very long did it take Ellen to see that Colter's object was to hide his tracks. He zigzagged through the forest, avoiding the bare spots of dust, the dry, sun-baked flats of clay where water lay in spring, and he chose the grassy open glades, the long pine-needle matted aisles. Ellen rode at their heels, and it pleased her to watch for their tracks. Colter manifestly had been long practiced in this game of hiding his trail, and he showed the skill of a rustler. But Ellen was not convinced that he could ever elude a real woodsman. Not improbably, however, Colter was only aiming to leave a trail difficult to follow, and which would allow him and his confederates ample time to forge ahead of pursuers. Ellen could not accept a certainty of pursuit. Yet Colter must have expected it, and Springer and Wells also, for they had a dark, sinister, furtive demeanor that strangely contrasted with the cool, easy manner habitual to them. They were not seeking the level routes of the forest land, that was sure. They rode straight across the thick timbered ridges down into another canyon, up out of that, and across rough, rocky bluffs, and down again. These riders headed a little to the northwest, and every mile brought them into wilder, more rugged country, until Ellen, losing count of canyons and ridges, had no idea where she was. No stop was made at noon to rest the laboring, sweating pack animals. Under circumstances where pleasure might have been possible, Ellen would have reveled in this hard ride into a wonderful forest, ever thickening and darkening. But the wild beauty of glade and the spruce slopes and the deep bronze-walled canyons left her cold. She saw and felt, but had no thrill, except now and then a thrill of alarm, when Spades slid to his haunches down some steep, damp, piney declivity. All the woodland up and down appeared to be richer, greener, as they traveled farther west. Grass grew thick and heavy. Water ran in all ravines. The rocks were bronze and copper and russet, and some had green patches of lichen. Ellen felt the sun now on her left cheek, and knew that the day was waning, and that Colter was swinging farther to the northwest. She had never before ridden through such heavy forest and down and up such wild canyons. Toward sunset, the deepest and ruggedest canyon halted their advance. Colter rode to the right, searching for a place to get down through a spruce thicket that stood on end. Presently he dismounted, and the others followed suit. Ellen found that she could not lead Spades because he slid down upon her heels, so she looped the end of her reins over the pommel and left him free. She herself managed to descend, by holding to branches and sliding all the way down that slope. She heard the horses cracking the brush, snorting and heaving. One pack slipped and had to be removed from the horse, and rolled down. At the bottom of this deep, green-walled notch roared a stream of water. Shadowed, cool, mossy, damp, this narrow gulch seemed the wildest place Ellen had ever seen. She could just see the sunset-flushed, gold-tipped spruces far above her. The men repacked the horse that had slipped his burden, and once more resumed their progress ahead, now turning up this canyon. There was no horse trail, but deer and bear trails were numerous. The sun sank and the sky darkened, but still the men rode on, and the farther they traveled, the wilder grew the aspect of the canyon. At length Colter broke away through a heavy thicket of willows and entered a side canyon, the mouth of which Ellen had not even descried. It turned and widened, and at length opened out into a round pocket, apparently enclosed, and as lonely and isolated a place as even pursued rustlers could desire. Hidden by jutting wall and thicket of spruce were two old log cabins, joined together by roof and attic floor, the same as the double cabin at the Jorth ranch. Ellen smelled wood smoke, and presently, on going round the cabins, she saw a bright fire. One man stood beside it, gazing at Colter's party, which evidently he had heard approaching. "Hello, Queen," said Colter. "How's Tad?" "He's holdin' on fine," replied Queen, bending over the fire where he turned pieces of meat. "Where's father?" suddenly asked Ellen, addressing Colter. As if he had not heard her, he went on wearily, loosening a pack. Queen looked at her. The light of the fire only partially shone on his face. Ellen could not see his expression, but from the fact that Queen did not answer her question, she got further intimation of impending catastrophe. The long, wild ride had helped prepare her for the secrecy and taciturnity of men who had resorted to flight. Perhaps her father had been delayed, or was still off on the deadly mission that had obsessed him, or there might, and probably was, darker reasons for his absence. Ellen shut her teeth and turned to the needs of her horse, and presently, returning to the fire, she thought of her uncle. "Queen, is my Uncle Tad here?" she asked. "Sure he's in there," replied Queen, pointing at the nearer cabin. Ellen hurried toward the dark doorway. She could see how the logs of the cabin had moved awry, and what a big, dilapidated hovel it was. As she looked in, Colter loomed over her, placed a familiar and somehow masterful hand upon her. Ellen let it rest on her shoulder a moment. Must she forever be repulsing these rude men among whom her lot was cast? Did Colter mean what Daggs had always meant? Ellen felt herself weary, weak in body, and her spent spirit had not rallied. Yet whatever Colter meant by his familiarity, she could not bear it. So she slipped out from under his hand. "Uncle Tad, are you here?" she called into the blackness. She heard the mice scamper and rustle, and she smelled the musty, old, woody odor of a long unused cabin. "Hello, Ellen," came a voice she recognized as her uncle's. Yet it was strange. "Yes, I'm here. Bad luck to me. How you bucking up, girl?" "I'm all right, Uncle Tad. Only tired and worried. "Tad, how's your hurt?" interrupted Colter. "Reckon I'm easier," replied Jorth wearily. "But shore I'm in bad shape. I'm still spitting blood. I keep telling Queen that bullet lodged in my lungs, but he says it went through." "Well, hang on, Tad," replied Colter, with a cheerfulness Ellen sensed was really indifferent. "Oh, what the hell's the use?" exclaimed Jorth. "It's all up with us, Colter." "Well, shut up, then," tersely returned Colter. "It ain't doing you or us any good to holler." Tad Jorth did not reply to this. Ellen heard his breathing, and it did not seem natural. It rasped a little, came hurriedly, then caught in his throat. Then he spat. Ellen shrunk back against the door. He was breathing through blood. "Uncle, are you in pain?" she asked. "Yes, Ellen. It burns like hell," he said. "Oh, I'm sorry. Isn't there something I can do?" "I reckon not. Queen did all anybody could do for me now, unless it's pray." Colter laughed at this, the slow, easy, drawling laugh of a Texan, but Ellen felt pity for this wounded uncle. She had always hated him. He had been a drunkard, a gambler, a waster of her father's property, and now he was a rustler and a fugitive, lying in pain, perhaps mortally hurt. "Yes, uncle, I will pray for you," she said softly. End of chapter 11, part 1. Section 22 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, part 2. The change in his voice held a note of sadness that she had been quick to catch. "Ellen, you're the only good Jorth in the whole damned lot," he said. "God, I see it all now. We've dragged you to hell." "Yes, Uncle Ted, I sure been dragged some, but not yet to hell," she responded, with a break in her voice. "You will be, Ellen, unless—" "Aw, shut up that kind of gab, will you?" broke in Colter, harshly. It amazed Ellen that Colter should dominate her uncle, even though he was wounded. Tad Jorth had been the last man to take orders from anyone, much less a rustler of the Hash Knife Gang. This Colter began to loom up in Ellen's estimate as he loomed physically over her, a lofty figure, dark, motionless, somehow menacing. "Ellen, has Colter told you yet about Lee and Jackson?" inquired the wounded man. The pitch black darkness of the cabin seemed to help fortify Ellen to bear further trouble. "Colter told me that Dad and Uncle Jackson would meet us here," she rejoined hurriedly. Jorth could be heard breathing in difficulty, and he coughed and spat again and seemed to hiss, "Ellen, he lied to you. They'll never meet us here." "Why not?" whispered Ellen. "Because, Ellen," he replied in husky pants, "your dad and Uncle Jackson are dead and buried." If Ellen suffered a terrible shock, it was a blankness, a deadness, a slow creeping failure of sense in her knees. They gave way under her, and she sank on the grass against the cabin wall. She did not faint, nor grow dizzy, nor lose her sight, but for a while there was no process of thought in her mind. Suddenly it was there, the quick, spiritual rending of her heart, followed by a profound emotion of intimate and irretrievable loss, and after that, grief and bitter realization. An hour later, Ellen found strength to go to the fire and partake of the food and drink her body sorely needed. Colter and the men waited on her solicitously and in silence, now and then stealing furtive glances at her from under the shadow of their black sombreros. The dark night settled down like a blanket. There were no stars. The wind moaned fitfully among the pines, and all about that lonely, hidden recess was in harmony with Ellen's thoughts. "Girl, you're sure game," said Colter admiringly, "and I reckon you never got it from the Jorths." "Tad in there, he's game," said Queen in mild protest. "Not to my notion," replied Colter. "Any man can be game when he's croaking with somebody around. But Lee Jorth and Jackson, they always was yellow clear to their gizzards. They was born in Louisiana, not Texas. Shore they're no more Texans than I am. Ellen here, she must have got another strain in her blood." To Ellen their words had no meaning. She rose and asked, "Where can I sleep?" "I'll fetch a light presently, and you can make your bed in there by Tad," replied Colter. "Yes, I'd like that." "Well, if you reckon you can coax him to talk, you're sure wrong," declared Colter, with that cold timbre of voice that struck like steel on Ellen's nerves. I cussed him good an' told him to keep his mouth shut. Talkin' makes him cough, an' that fetches up the blood. Besides, I reckon I'm the one to tell you how your dad an' uncle got killed. Tad didn't see it done, an' he was bad hurt when it happened. Shore all the fellars left have their idea about it, but I've got it straight." "Colter, tell me now," cried Ellen. "Wal, all right. Come over here," he replied, and drew her away from the camp fire out in the shadow of gloom. "Poor kid! I shore feel bad about it." He put a long arm around her waist and drew her against him. Ellen felt it, yet did not offer any resistance. All her faculties seemed absorbed in a morbid and sad anticipation. "Ellen, you shore know I always loved you, now don't you?" he asked, with suppressed breath. "No, Colter, it's news to me, and not what I want to hear." "Wal, you may as well hear it right now," he said. "It's true. And what's more, your dad gave you to me before he died." "What? Colter? You must be a liar." "Ellen, I swear I'm not lying," he returned, in eager passion. "I was with your dad last and heard him last. He shore knew I loved you for years. And he said he'd rather you be left in my care than anybody's." "My father gave you to me in marriage?" ejaculated Ellen, in bewilderment. Colter's ready assurance did not carry him over this point. It was evident that her words somewhat surprised and disconcerted him for the moment. "To let me marry a rustler one of the Hash Knife Gang?" exclaimed Ellen, with weary incredulity. "Wal, your dad belonged to Daggs's gang, same as I do," replied Colter, recovering his cool ardor. "No!" cried Ellen. "Yes, he shore did for years," declared Colter, positively. "Back in Texas. An' it was your dad that got Daggs to come to Arizona." Ellen tried to fling herself away, but her strength and her spirit were ebbing, and Colter increased the pressure of his arm. All at once she sank limp. Could she escape her fate? Nothing seemed left to fight with or for. "All right. Don't hold me so tight," she panted. "Now tell me how Dad was killed. And who?" Colter bent over her so he could peer into her face. In the darkness Ellen just caught the gleam of his eyes. She felt the virile force of the man in the strain of his body as he pressed her close. It all seemed unreal, a hideous dream, the gloom, the moan of the wind, the weird solitude, and this rustler with hands and will like cold steel. "We'd come back to Greaves's store," Colter began. "An' as Greaves was dead we all got free with his liquor. Shore some of us got drunk. Bruce was drunk, an' Tad in there, he was drunk. Your dad put away more than I ever seen him. But shore he wasn't exactly drunk. He got one of them weak an' shaky spells. He cried an' he wanted some of us to get the Isbels to call off the fightin'. He shore was ready to call it quits. I reckon the killin' of Daggs an' then the awful way Greaves was cut up by Jean Isbel took all the fight out of your dad. He said to me, 'Colter, we'll take Ellen an' leave this heah country an' begin life all over again, where no one knows us.'" "Oh, did he really say that? Did he really mean it?" murmured Ellen, with a sob. "I swear it by the memory of my dead mother," protested Colter. "Well, when night come the Isbels rode down on us in the dark an' began to shoot. They smashed in the door, tried to burn us out, an' hollered around for a while. Then they left, an' we reckoned there'd be no more trouble that night. All the same we kept watch. I was the soberest one, an' I bossed the gang. We had some quarrels about the drinkin'. Your dad said if we kept it up it'd be the end of the Jorths. An' he planned to send word to the Isbels next mornin' that he was ready for a truce. An' I was to go fix it up with Gaston Isbel. Well, your dad went to bed in Greaves's room, an' a little while later your Uncle Jackson went in there too. Some of the men laid down in the store an' went to sleep. I kept guard till about 3 in the morning, and I got so sleepy I couldn't hold my eyes open. So I waked up Wells and Slater and set them on guard, one at each end of the store. Then I laid down on the counter to take a nap." Colter's low voice, the strain and breathlessness of him, the agitation which he appeared to be laboring, and especially the simple, matter-of-fact detail of his story, carried absolute conviction to Ellen Jorth. Her vague doubt of him had been created by his attitude toward her. Emotion dominated her intelligence. The images, the scenes called up by Colter's words, were as true as the gloom of the wild gulch and the loneliness of the night solitude, as true as the strange fact that she lay passive in the arms of a rustler. "Well, after a while I woke up," went on Colter, clearing his throat. "It was gray dawn. All was still as death. And something sure was wrong. Wells and Slater had got to drinking again and now lay dead drunk or asleep. Anyways, when I kicked them, they never moved. Then I heard a moan. It came from the room where your dad and uncle was. I went in. It was just light enough to see. Your Uncle Jackson was laying on the floor, cut half in two, dead as a doornail. Your dad lay on the bed. He was alive, breathing his last. He says, 'That half-breed Isbel knifed us while we slept.' The window shutter was open. I seen where Jean Isbel had come in and gone out. I seen his moccasin tracks in the dirt outside, and I seen where he'd stepped in Jackson's blood and tracked it to the window. You sure can see them bloody tracks yourself if you go back to Greaves's store. Your dad was going fast. He said, 'Colter, take care of Ellen,' and I reckon he meant a lot by that. He kept saying, 'My God, if I'd only seen Gaston Isbel before it was too late.' And then he raved a little, whispering out of his head. And after that he died. I woke up the men, and about sunup we carried your dad and uncle out of town and buried them. And them Isbels shot at us while we were burying our dead. That's where Tad got his hurt. Then we hit the trail for Jorth's ranch. And now, Ellen, that's all my story. Your dad was ready to bury the hatchet with his old enemy. And that Nez Perce Jean Isbel, like the sneaking savage he is, murdered your uncle and your dad. Cut 'em horrible. Made 'em suffer tortures of hell. All for Isbel revenge." When Colter's husky voice ceased, Ellen whispered through lips as cold and still as ice, "Let me go. Leave me here alone." "Why, shore, I reckon I understand," replied Colter. "I hated to tell you, but you had to hear the truth about that half breed. I'll carry your pack in the cabin and unroll your blankets." Releasing her, Colter strode off in the gloom. Like a dead weight, Ellen began to slide until she slipped down full length beside the log. And then she lay in the cool, damp shadow, inert and lifeless so far as outward physical movement was concerned. She saw nothing and felt nothing of the night, the wind, the cold, the falling dew. For the moment or hour she was crushed by despair and seemed to see herself sinking down and down into a black, bottomless pit, into an abyss where murky tides of blood and furious gusts of passion contended between her body and her soul, into the stormy blast of hell. In her despair she longed, she ached for death. Born of infidelity, cursed by the taint of evil blood, further cursed by higher instinct for good and happy life, dragged from one lonely and wild and sordid spot to another, never knowing love or peace or joy or home, left to the companionship of violent and vile men, driven by a strange fate to love with unquenchable and insupportable love a half-breed, a savage, an Isbel, the hereditary enemy of her people, and at last the ruthless murderer of her father. What in the name of God had she left to live for? Revenge? An eye for an eye, a life for a life. But she could not kill Jean Isbel. Woman's love could turn to hate, but not the love of Ellen Jorth. He could drag her by the hair in the dust, beat her, and make her a thing to loathe, and cut her mortally in his savage and implacable thirst for revenge. But, with her last gasp, she would whisper she loved him, and that she had lied to him to kill his faith. It was that, his strange faith in her purity, which had won her love. Of all men, that he should be the one to recognize the truth of her, the womanhood yet unsullied. How strange, how terrible, how overpowering! False indeed was she to the Jorths, false as her mother had been to an Isbel. This agony and destruction of her soul was the bitter Dead Sea fruit, the sins of her parents visited upon her. "I'll end it all," she whispered to the night shadows that hovered over her. No coward was she. No fear of pain or mangled flesh or death or the mysterious hereafter could ever stay her. It would be easy. It would be a last thrill, a transport of self-abasement and the supreme self-proof of her love for Jean Isbel, to kiss the rim rock where his feet had trod and then fling herself down into the depths. She was the last Jorth, so the wronged Isbels would be avenged. But he would never know. Never know I lied to him, she wailed to the night wind. She was lost, lost on earth and to hope of heaven. She had a right to neither live nor to die. She was nothing but a little weed along the trail of life, trampled upon, buried in the mud. She was nothing but a single rotten thread in a tangled web of love and hate and revenge. And she had broken. Lower and lower she seemed to sink. Was there no end to this gulf of despair? If Colter had returned, he would have found her a rag and a toy, a creature degraded, fit for his vile embrace, to be thrust deeper into the mire, to be punished fittingly for her betrayal of a man's noble love and her own womanhood, to be made an end of body, mind, and soul. But Colter did not return. The wind mourned, the owls hooted, the leaves rustled, the insects whispered their melancholy night song. The campfire flickered and faded. Then the wild forest land seemed to close imponderably over Ellen. All that she wailed in her despair, all that she confessed in her abasement, was true and hard as life could be. But she belonged to nature. If nature had not failed her, had God failed her? It was there, the lonely land of trees and fern and flower and brook, full of wild birds and beasts, where the mossy rocks could speak and the solitude had ears, where she had always felt herself unutterably a part of creation. Thus a wavering spark of hope quivered through the blackness of her soul and gathered light. The gloom of the sky, the shifting clouds of dull shade, split asunder to show a glimpse of a radiant star, piercingly white, cold, pure, a steadfast eye of the universe, beyond all understanding and illimitable with its meaning of the past and the present and the future. Ellen watched it until the drifting clouds once more hid it from her strained sight. What had that star to do with hell? She might be crushed and destroyed by life, but was there not something beyond? Just to be born, just to suffer, just to die, could that be all? Despair did not lose its hold on Ellen. The strife and pang of her breast did not subside. But with the long hours and the strange closing in of the forest around her, and the fleeting glimpse of that wonderful star, with a subtle divination of the meaning of her beating heart and throbbing mind, and lastly, with a voice thundering at her conscience that a man's faith in a woman must not be greater, nobler than her faith in God and eternity, with these she checked the dark flight of her soul toward destruction. End of chapter 11, part 2. Section 23 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Part 1. A chill, gray, somber dawn was breaking when Ellen dragged herself into the cabin and crept under her blankets, there to sleep the sleep of exhaustion. When she awoke, the hour appeared to be late afternoon. Sun and sky shone through the sunken and decayed roof of the old cabin. Her uncle, Tad Jorth, lay upon a blanket bed, upheld by a crude couch of boughs. The light fell upon his face, pale, lined, cast in a still mold of suffering. He was not dead, for she heard his respiration. The floor underneath Ellen's blankets was bare clay. She and Jorth were alone in this cabin. It contained nothing besides their beds and a rank growth of weeds along the decayed lower logs. Half of the cabin had a rude ceiling of rough-hewn boards, which formed a kind of loft. This attic extended through to the adjoining cabin, forming the ceiling of the porch-like space between the two structures. There was no partition. A ladder of 2 aspen saplings, pegged to the logs, and with braces between for steps, led up to the attic. Ellen smelled wood smoke and the odor of frying meat, and she heard the voices of men. She looked out to see that Slater and Somers had joined their party, an addition that might have strengthened it for defense, but did not lend to her own situation anything favorable. Somers had always appeared the one best to avoid. Colter espied her and called her to come and feed your pale face. His comrades laughed, not loudly but guardedly, as if noise was something to avoid. Nevertheless, they awoke Tad Jorth, who began to toss and moan on the bed. Ellen hurried to his side, and at once ascertained that he had a high fever and was in a critical condition. Every time he tossed, he opened a wound in his right breast rather high up. For all she could see, nothing had been done for him except the binding of a scarf round his neck and under his arm. This scant bandage had worked loose. Going to the door, she called out, "Fetch me some water." When Colter brought it, Ellen was rummaging in her pack for some clothing or towel that she could use for bandages. "Weren't any of you decent enough to look after my uncle?" she queried. "Huh? Well, what the hell?" rejoined Colter. "We sure did all we could. I reckon you think it wasn't a tough job to pack him up the rim. He was done for then, and I said so." "I'll do all I can for him," said Ellen. "Sure, go ahead. When I get plugged or knifed by that half-breed, I sure hope you'll be round to nurse me." "You seem to be pretty sure of your fate, Colter." "Sure as hell," he bit out darkly. "Somers saw Isbel and his gang trailing us to the Jorth ranch." "Are you going to stay here and wait for them?" "Sure. I've been quarreling with the fellows out there over that very question. I'm for leaving the country, but Queen, the damn gunfighter, is dead set to kill that cowman Blue, who swore he was King Fisher, the old Texas outlaw. None but Queen are spoiling for another fight. All the same, they won't leave Tad Jorth here alone." Then Colter leaned in at the door and whispered, "Ellen, I can't boss this outfit, so let's you and me shake 'em. I've got your dad's gold. Let's ride off tonight and shake this country." Colter, muttering under his breath, left the door and returned to his comrades. Ellen had received her first intimation of his cowardice, and his mention of her father's gold started a train of thought that persisted in spite of her efforts to put all her mind to attending her uncle. He grew conscious enough to realize her working over him, and thanked her with a look that touched Ellen deeply. It changed the direction of her mind. His suffering and imminent death, which she was able to alleviate and retard somewhat, worked upon her pity and compassion so that she forgot her own plight. Half the night she was tending him, cooling his fever, holding him quiet. Well, she realized that but for her ministrations he would have died. At length he went to sleep. And Ellen, sitting beside him in the lonely, silent darkness of that late hour, received again the intimation of nature, those vague and nameless stirrings of her innermost being, those whisperings out of the night and the forest and the sky. Something great would not let go of her soul. She pondered. Attention to the wounded man occupied Ellen, and soon she redoubled her activities in this regard, finding in them something of protection against Colter. He had waylaid her as she went to the spring for water, with a lunge like that of a bear. He had tried to embrace her, but Ellen had been too quick. "Well, are you going away with me?" he demanded. "No, I'll stick by my uncle," she replied. That motive of hers seemed to obstruct his will. Ellen was keen to see that Colter and his comrades were at a last stand and disintegrating under a severe strain. Nerve and courage of the open and the wild they possessed, but only in a limited degree. Colter seemed obsessed by his passion for her, and though Ellen in her stubborn pride did not yet fear him, she realized she ought to. After that incident she watched closely, never leaving her uncle's bedside except when Colter was absent. One or more of the men kept constant lookout somewhere down the canyon. Day after day passed on the wings of suspense, of watching, of ministering to her uncle, of waiting for some hour that seemed fixed. Colter was like a hound upon her trail. At every turn he was there to importune her to run off with him, to frighten her with the menace of the Isbels, to beg her to give herself to him. It came to pass that the only relief she had was when she ate with the men or barred the cabin door at night. Not much relief, however, was there in the shut and barred door. With one thrust of his powerful arm Colter could have caved it in. He knew this as well as Ellen. Still she did not have the fear she should have had. There was her rifle beside her, and though she did not allow her mind to run darkly on its possible use, still the fact of it being there at hand somehow strengthened her. Colter was a cat playing with a mouse, but not yet sure of his quarry. Ellen came to know hours when she was weak physically, mentally, spiritually, morally, when, under the sheer weight of this frightful and growing burden of suspense, she was not capable of fighting her misery, her abasement, her low ebb of vitality, and at the same time wholly withstanding Colter's advances. He would come into the cabin, and utterly indifferent to Tad Jorth, he would try to make bold and unrestrained love to Ellen. When he caught her in one of her unresisting moments and was able to hold her in his arms and kiss her, he seemed to be beside himself with the wonder of her. At such moments, if he had any softness or gentleness in him, they expressed themselves in his sooner or later letting her go, when apparently she was about to faint. So it must have become fascinatingly fixed in Colter's mind that at times Ellen repulsed him with scorn, and at others could not resist him. Ellen had escaped two crises in her relation with this man, and as a morbid doubt, like a poisonous fungus, began to strangle her mind, she instinctively divined that there was an approaching and final crisis. No uplift of her spirit came this time, no intimations, no whisperings. How horrible it all was! Too long to be good and noble, to realize that she was neither, to sink lower day by day. Must she decay like one of these rotting logs? Worst of all, then, was the insinuating and ever-growing hopelessness. What was the use? What did it matter? Who would ever think of Ellen Jorth? "Oh, God," she whispered in her distraction, "is nothing left, nothing at all?" A period of several days of less torment to Ellen followed. Her uncle apparently took a turn for the better, and Colter let her alone. This last circumstance nonplussed Ellen. She was at a loss to understand it unless the Isbel menace now encroached upon Colter so formidably that he had forgotten her for the present. Then one bright August morning, when she had begun to relax her eternal vigilance and breathe without oppression, Colter encountered her, darkly silent and fierce. He grasped her and drew her off her feet. Ellen struggled violently, but the total surprise had deprived her of strength, and that paralyzing weakness assailed her as never before. Without apparent effort, Colter carried her, striding rapidly away from the cabins into the border of spruce trees at the foot of the canyon wall. "Colter, where? Oh, where are you taking me?" she found voice to cry out. "By God, I don't know," he replied, with strong, vibrant passion. "I was a fool not to carry you off long ago. But I waited. I was hopin' you'd love me. An' now that Isbel gang has corralled us. Somers has seen the half breed up on the rocks, an' Springer's seen the rest of them sneakin' around. I run back after my horse an' you." "But Uncle Tad, we mustn't leave him alone," cried Ellen. "We've got to," replied Colter grimly. "Tad shore won't worry you no more soon as Jean Isbel gets to him." "Oh, let me stay," implored Ellen. "I will save him." Colter laughed at the utter absurdity of her appeal and claim. Suddenly he set her down upon her feet. "Stand still," he ordered. Ellen saw his big bay horse saddled with pack and blanket tied there in the shade of a spruce. With swift hands Colter untied him and mounted him, scarcely moving his piercing gaze from Ellen. He reached to grasp her. "Up with you. Put your foot in the stirrup." His will, like his powerful arm, was irresistible for Ellen at that moment. She found herself swung up behind him. Then the horse plunged away. What with the hard motion and Colter's iron grasp on her, Ellen was in a painful position. Her knees and feet came into violent contact with branches and snags. He galloped the horse, tearing through the dense thicket of willows that served to hide the entrance to the side canyon, and when out in the larger and more open canyon he urged him to a run. Presently, when Colter put the horse to a slow rise of ground, thereby bringing him to a walk, it was just in time to save Ellen a serious bruising. Again the sunlight appeared to shade over. They were in the pines. Suddenly, with backward lunge, Colter halted the horse. Ellen heard a yell. She recognized Queen's voice. "Turn back, Colter, turn back." With an oath Colter wheeled his mount. "If I didn't run plumb into them," he ejaculated harshly, and scarcely had the goaded horse gotten a start when a shot rang out. Ellen felt a violent shock, as if her momentum had suddenly met with a check, and then she felt herself wrenched from Colter, from the saddle, and propelled into the air. She alighted on soft ground and thick grass, and was unhurt save for the violent wrench and shaking that had rendered her breathless. Before she could rise, Colter was pulling at her, lifting her to her feet. She saw the horse lying with bloody head. Tall pines loomed all around. Another rifle cracked. "Run!" hissed Colter, and he bounded off, dragging her by the hand. Another yell pealed out. "Here we are, Colter." Again it was Queen's shrill voice. Ellen ran with all her might, her heart in her throat, and her sight failing to record more than a blur of passing pines and a blank green wall of spruce. Then she lost her balance, was falling, yet she could not fall because of that steel grip on her hand, and was dragged and finally carried into a dense shade. She was blinded. The trees whirled and faded. Voices and shots sounded far away. Then something black seemed to be wiped across her feeling. It turned to gray, to moving blankness, to dim, hazy objects, spectral and tall, like blanketed trees, and when Ellen fully recovered consciousness she was being carried through the forest. "Well, little one, "That was a close shave for you," said Colter's hard voice, growing clearer. "Reckon your keelin' over was natural enough." He held her lightly in both arms, her head resting above his left elbow. Ellen saw his face as a gray blur, then taking sharper outline until it stood out distinctly, pale and clammy, with eyes cold and wonderful in their intense flare. As she gazed upward, Colter turned his head to look back through the woods, and his motion betrayed a keen, wild vigilance. The veins of his lean brown neck stood out like whipcords. Two comrades were stalking beside him. Ellen heard their stealthy steps, and she felt Colter sheer from one side to the other. They were proceeding cautiously, fearful of the rear, but not wholly trusting to the fore. "Reckon we'd better go slow and look before we leap," said one whose voice Ellen recognized as Springer's. "Shore that open slope ain't to my liking, with our Nez Perce friend prowling round," drawled Colter as he set Ellen down on her feet. Another of the rustlers laughed. "Say, can't he twinkle through the forest? I had 4 shots at him. Harder to hit than a turkey running crossways." This facetious speaker was the evil-visaged, sardonic Somers. He carried 2 rifles and wore 2 belts of cartridges. "Ellen, shore he ain't so dead white as he was," observed Colter, and he chucked her under the chin with familiar hand. "Sit down here. I don't want you stopping any bullets. And there's no telling." Ellen was glad to comply with his wish. She had begun to recover wits and strength, yet she still felt shaky. She observed that their position then was on the edge of a well-wooded slope from which she could see the grassy canyon floor below. They were on a level bench projecting out from the main canyon wall that loomed gray and rugged and pine-fringed. Somers and Colter and Springer gave careful attention to all points of the compass, especially in the direction from which they had come. They evidently anticipated being trailed or circled or headed off, but did not manifest much concern. Somers lit a cigarette. Springer wiped his face with a grimy hand and counted the shells in his belt, which appeared to be half empty. Colter stretched his long neck like a vulture and peered down the slope and through the aisles of the forest up toward the canyon rim. End of chapter 12, part 1. Section 24 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, part 2. "Listen," he said tersely, and bent his head a little to one side, ear to the slight breeze. They all listened. Ellen heard the beating of her heart, the rustle of leaves, the tapping of a woodpecker, and faint, remote sounds that she could not name. "Deer, I reckon," spoke up Somers. "Aw, well, I reckon they ain't trailin' us yet," replied Colter. "We gave them a shade better than they sent us." "Short and sweet," ejaculated Springer, and he removed his black sombrero to poke a dirty finger through a bullet hole in the crown. "That's how close I come to cachin'. I was lying behind a log, listening and watching, and when I stuck my head up a little, zam! Somebody made my bonnet leak." "Where's Queen?" asked Colter. "He was with me first off," replied Somers. "And then when the shooting slacked, after I plugged that big red-faced, white-haired pal of Isbel's—" "Reckon that was Blaisdell," interrupted Springer. "Queen, he got tired layin' low," went on Somers. "He wanted action. I heard him chewing to himself, and when I asked him what was eating him, he upped and growled that he was going to quit this Injun fighting, and he slipped off in the woods." "Well, that's the gunfighter of it," declared Colter, wagging his head. "Ever since that cowman Blue braced us and said he was Kingfisher, why Queen has been sulkier and sulkier. He can't help it. He'll do the same trick as Blue tried, and he'll shore get his everlasting. But he's the Texas breed, all right." "Say, do you reckon Blue really is Kingfisher?" queried Somers. "Naw," ejaculated Colter, with downward sweep of his hand. "Many a would-be gunslinger has borrowed Fisher's name. But Fisher is dead these many years." "Ah, well, maybe. But don't you forget it. That Blue was no would-be," declared Somers. "He was the genuine article." "I should smile," affirmed Springer. The subject irritated Colter. He dismissed it with another forcible gesture and a counter question. "How many left in that Isbel outfit?" "No tellin'. There was shore enough of 'em," replied Somers. "Anyhow, the woods was full of flyin' bullets. Springer, did you account for any of them?" "Nope, not that I noticed," responded Springer dryly. "I had my chance at the half breed. Reckon I was nervous." "Was Slater near you when he yelled out?" "No, he was lyin' beside Somers." "Wasn't that a queer way for a man to act?" broke in Somers. "A bullet hit Slater, cut him down the back as he was lyin' flat. Reckon it wasn't bad, but it hurt him so that he jumped right up and staggered around. He made a target as big as a tree. An' maybe them Isbels didn't riddle him." "That was when I got my crack at Bill Isbel," declared Colter, with grim satisfaction. "When they shot my horse out from under me I had Ellen to think of an' couldn't get my rifle. Shore had to run, as you seen. Well, as I only had my 6-shooter, there was nothin' for me to do but lay low an' listen to the sping of lead. Wells was standin' up behind a tree about 30 yards off. He got plugged, an' fallin' over, he began to crawl my way, still holdin' to his rifle. I crawled along the log to meet him, but he dropped about halfway. I went on an' took his rifle an' belt. When I peeped out from behind a spruce bush, then I seen Bill Isbel. He was shootin' fast, an' all of them was shootin' fast. That was when they had the open shot at Slater. Well, I bored Bill Isbel right through his middle. He dropped his rifle, an' all bent double he fooled around in a circle till he flopped over the rim. I reckon he's layin' right up there somewhere below that dead spruce. I'd shore like to see him." "Ah, you'd be crazy as Queen if you tried that," declared Somers. "We're not out of the woods yet." "I reckon not," replied Colter. "An' I've lost my horse. Where'd you leave yours?" "They're down the canyon below that willow brake, an' saddled an' none of 'em tied. Reckon we'll have to look them up before dark." "Colter, what are we going to do?" demanded Springer. "Wait here a while, then cross the canyon an' work round up under the bluff back to the cabin." "And then what?" queried Somers, doubtfully eyeing Colter. "We've got to eat, and we've got to have blankets," rejoined Colter testily. "And I reckon we can hide there and stand a better show in a fight than running for it in the woods." "Wal, I'm givin' you a hunch that it looked like you were running for it," retorted Somers. "Yes, and packing the girl," added Springer. "Looks funny to me." Both rustlers eyed Colter with dark and distrustful glances. What he might have replied never transpired, for the reason that his gaze, always shifting around, had suddenly fixed on something. "Is that a wolf?" he asked, pointing to the rim. Both his comrades moved to get in line with his finger. Ellen could not see from her position. "Shore that's a big lofer," declared Somers. "Reckon he scented us." "There he goes along the rim," observed Colter. "He doesn't act leery. Looks like a good sign to me. Maybe the Isbels have gone the other way." "Looks bad to me," rejoined Springer gloomily. "And why?" demanded Colter. "I seen that animal. First time I reckoned it was a lofer. Second time it was right near them Isbels. An' I'm damned now if I don't believe it's that half lofer sheep dog of Gass Isbel's." "Well, what if it is?" "Ha! Shore we needn't worry about hidin' out," replied Springer sententiously. "With that dog Jean Isbel could trail a grasshopper." "The hell you say!" muttered Colter. Manifestly, such a possibility put a different light upon the present situation. The men grew silent and watchful, occupied by brooding thoughts and vigilant surveillance of all points. Somers slipped off into the brush, soon to return, with intent look of importance. "I heerd somethin'," he whispered, jerking his thumb backward. "Rolling gravel, crackin' of twigs. No deer. Reckon it'd be a good idea for us to slip round across this bench." "Well, you fellars go, and I'll watch here," returned Colter. "Not much," said Somers, while Springer leered knowingly. Colter became incensed, but he did not give way to it. Pondering a moment, he finally turned to Ellen. "You wait here till I come back, and if I don't come in reasonable time, you slip across the canyon and through the willows to the cabins. Wait till about dark." With that he possessed himself of one of the extra rifles and belts and silently joined his comrades. Together they noiselessly stole into the brush. Ellen had no other thought than to comply with Colter's wishes. There was her wounded uncle, who had been left unattended, and she was anxious to get back to him. Besides, if she had wanted to run off from Colter, where could she go? Alone in the woods she would get lost and die of starvation. Her lot must be cast with the Jorth faction until the end. That did not seem far away. Her strained attention and suspense made the moments fly by. By and by, several shots pealed out far across the side canyon on her right, and they were answered by reports sounding closer to her. The fight was on again, but these shots were not repeated. The flies buzzed. The hot sun beat down and sloped to the west. The soft, warm breeze stirred the aspens. The ravens croaked. The red squirrels and blue jays chattered. Suddenly a quick, short yelp electrified Ellen, brought her upright with sharp, listening rigidity. Sure it was not a wolf, and hardly could it be a coyote. Again she heard it, the yelp of a sheepdog. She had heard that often enough to know, and she rose to change her position so she could command a view of the rocky bluff above. Presently she espied what really appeared to be a big timber wolf. But another yelp satisfied her that it really was a dog. She watched him. Soon it became evident that he wanted to get down over the bluff. He ran to and fro and then out of sight. In a few moments his yelp sounded from lower down at the base of the bluff, and it was now the cry of an intelligent dog that was trying to call someone to his aid. Ellen grew convinced that the dog was near where Colter had said Bill Isbel had plunged over the declivity. Would the dog yelp that way if the man was dead? Ellen thought not. No one came, and the continuous yelping of the dog got on Ellen's nerves. It was a call for help, and finally she surrendered to it. Since her natural terror when Colter's horse was shot out from under her and she had been dragged away, she had not recovered from fear of the Isbels. But calm consideration now convinced her that she could hardly be in a worse plight in their hands than if she remained with Colter's. So she started out to find the dog. The wooded bench was level for a few hundred yards, and then it began to heave in rugged rocky bulges up toward the rim. It did not appear far to where the dog was barking, but the latter part of the distance proved to be a hard climb over jumbled rocks and through thick brush. Panting and hot, she at length reached the base of the bluff, to find that it was not very high. The dog espied her before she saw him, for he was coming toward her when she discovered him. Big, shaggy, grayish white and black, with wild, keen face and eyes he assuredly looked the reputation Springer had accorded him. But sagacious, guarded was his approach. He appeared friendly. "Hello, doggy," panted Ellen. "What's wrong up here?" He yelped. His ears lost their stiffness. His body sank a little, and his bushy tail wagged to and fro. What a gray, clear, intelligent look he gave her! Then he trotted back. Ellen followed him around a corner of bluff to see the body of a man lying on his back. Fresh earth and gravel lay about him, attesting to his fall from above. He had on neither coat nor hat, and the position of his body and limbs suggested broken bones. Ellen hurried to his side. She saw that the front of his shirt low down was a bloody blotch, but he could lift his head, his eyes were open, and he was perfectly conscious. Ellen did not recognize the dusty, skinned face, yet the mold of features, the look of the eyes, seemed strangely familiar. "You're Jorth's girl," he said, in faint voice of surprise. "Yes, I'm Ellen Jorth," she replied. "And are you Bill Isbel?" "All that's left of me. But I'm thankin' God somebody come, even a Jorth." Ellen knelt beside him and examined the wound in his abdomen. A heavy bullet had indeed, as Colter had avowed, torn clear through his middle. Even if he had not sustained other serious injury from the fall over the cliff, the terrible bullet wound meant death very shortly. Ellen shuddered. How inexplicable were men! How cruel, bloody, mindless! "Isbel, I'm sorry. There's no hope," she said, low voiced. "You've not long to live. I can't help you. God knows I'd do so if I could." "All over," he sighed, with his eyes looking beyond her. "I reckon. I'm glad. But you can do something for me, will you?" "Indeed, yes. Tell me," she replied, lifting his dusty head on her knee. Her hands trembled as she brushed his wet hair back from his clammy brow. "I've something on my conscience," he whispered. The woman, the sensitive in Ellen, understood and pitied him then. "Yes," she encouraged him. "I stole cattle. My dad's in Blaisdell's, and made deals with Daggs. All the crookedness wasn't on Jorth's side. I want my brother Jean to know." "I'll try to tell him," whispered Ellen, out of her great amaze. "We were all a bad lot except Jean," went on Isbel. "Dad wasn't fair. God, how he hated Jorth! Jorth, yes, who was your father. Well, they're even now." "How so?" faltered Ellen. "Your father killed Dad. At the last Dad wanted to save us. He sent word he'd meet him face to face and let that end the feud. They met out in the road. But some one shot Dad down with a rifle, and then your father finished him." "And then Isbel," added Ellen, with unconscious mocking bitterness, "your brother murdered my dad." "What?" whispered Bill Isbel. "Shore you got it wrong. I reckon Jean could have killed your father, but he didn't. Queer, we all thought." "Ah, who did kill my father?" burst out Ellen, and her voice rang like great hammers at her ears. "It was Blue. He went in the store alone, faced the whole gang alone, bluffed them, taunted them, told them he was King Fisher. Then he killed your dad and Jackson Jorth, and Jean was out back of the store. We were out front. There was shooting. Kilmer was hit. Then Blue ran out, bad hurt. Both of them died in Meeker's yard." "And so Jean Isbel has not killed a Jorth?" said Ellen, in strange, deep voice. "No," replied Isbel earnestly. "I reckon this feud was hardest on Jean. He never lived here. And my sister Ann said he got sweet on you. Now, did he?" Slow, stinging tears filled Ellen's eyes, and her head sank low and lower. "Yes, he did," she murmured, tremulously. "Ah, well, that accounts," replied Isbel, wonderingly. "Too bad. It might have been. A man always sees different when he's dying. If I had my life to live over again. My poor kids deserted in their babyhood, ruined for life, all for nothing. May God forgive." Then he choked and whispered for water. Ellen laid his head back, and rising, she took a sombrero and started hurriedly down the slope, making dust fly and rocks roll. Her mind was a seething ferment. Leaping, bounding, sliding down the weathered slope, she gained the bench to run across that, and so on down into the open canyon to the willow bordered brook. Here she filled the sombrero with water and started back, forced now to walk slowly and carefully. It was then, with the violence and fury of intense muscular activity denied her, that the tremendous import of Bill Isbel's revelation burst upon her very flesh and blood, and transfiguring the very world of golden light and azure sky and speaking forest land that encompassed her. Not a drop of the precious water did she spill, not a misstep did she make, yet so great was the spell upon her that she was not aware she had climbed the steep slope until the dog yelped his welcome. Then, with all the flood of her emotions surging and resurging, she knelt to allay the parching thirst of this dying enemy whose words had changed frailty to strength, hate to love, and the gloomy hell of despair to something unutterable. But she had returned too late. Bill Isbel was dead. End of chapter 12, part 2. Section 25 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Part 1. Jean Isbel, holding the wolf dog Shep in leash, was on the trail of the most dangerous of Jorth's gang, the gunman Queen. Dark drops of blood on the stones and plain tracks of a rider's sharp-heeled boots behind coverts indicated the trail of a wounded, slow-traveling fugitive. Therefore Jean Isbel held in the dog and proceeded with the wary eye and watchful caution of an Indian. Queen, true to his class and emulating Blue, with the same magnificent effrontery and with the same paralyzing suddenness of surprise, had appeared as if by magic at the last night camp of the Isbel faction. Jean had seen him first, in time to leap like a panther into the shadow, but he carried in his shoulder Queen's first bullet of that terrible encounter. Upon Gordon and Fredericks fell the brunt of Queen's fusillade, and they, shot to pieces, staggering and falling, held passionate grip on life long enough to draw and still Queen's guns and send him reeling off into the darkness of the forest. Unarmed and hindered by a painful wound, Jean had kept a vigil near camp that silent and menacing night. Morning disclosed Gordon and Fredericks stark and ghastly beside the burned-out campfire, their guns clutched immovably in stiffened hands. Jean buried them as best he could, and when they were underground with flat stones on their graves, he knew himself to be indeed the last of the Isbel clan. And all that was wild and savage in his blood and desperate in his spirit rose to make him more than man and less than human. Then, for the third time during these tragic last days, the wolf dog Shep came to him. Jean washed the wound Queen had given him and bound it tightly. The keen pang and burn of the lead was a constant and all-powerful reminder of the grim work left for him to do. The whole world was no longer large enough for him and whoever was left of the Jorths. The heritage of blood his father had bequeathed him, the unshakable love for a worthless girl who had so dwarfed and obstructed his will and so bitterly defeated and reviled his poor, romantic, boyish faith, the killing of hostile men, so strange in its after effects, the pursuits and fights, and loss of one by one of his confederates, these had finally engendered in Jean Isbel a wild, unslackable thirst. These had been the cause of his retrogression. These had unalterably and ruthlessly fixed in his darkened mind one fierce passion: to live and die the last man of that Jorth Isbel feud. At sunrise Jean left this camp, taking with him only a small knapsack of meat and bread, and with the eager wild Shep in leash he set out on Queen's bloody trail. Black drops of blood on the stones and an irregular trail of footprints proved to Jean that the gunman was hard hit. Here he had fallen, or knelt, or sat down, evidently to bind his wounds. Jean found strips of scarf, red and discarded, and the blood drops failed to show on more rocks. In a deep forest of spruce, under silver tipped spreading branches, Queen had rested, perhaps slept. Then, laboring with dragging steps, not improbably with a lame leg, he had gone on, up out of the dark green ravine to the open, dry, pine tipped ridge. Here he had rested, perhaps waited to see if he were pursued. From that point his trail spoke an easy language for Jean's keen eye. The gunman knew he was pursued. He had seen his enemy. Therefore Jean proceeded with a slow caution, never getting within revolver range of ambush, using all his woodcraft to trail this man and yet save himself. Queen traveled slowly, either because he was wounded or else because he tried to ambush his pursuer. And Jean accommodated his pace to that of Queen. From noon of that day they were never far apart, never out of hearing of a rifle shot. The contrast of the beauty and peace and loneliness of the surroundings to the nature of Queen's flight often obtruded its strange truth into the somber turbulence of Jean's mind, into that fixed columnar idea around which fleeting thoughts hovered and gathered like shadows. Early frost had touched the heights with its magic wand, and the forest seemed a temple in which man might worship nature and life rather than steal through the dells and under the archdials like a beast of prey. The green and gold leaves of aspens quivered in the glades. Maples in the ravines fluttered their red and purple leaves. The needle-matted carpet under the pines vied with the long lanes of silver grass, alike enticing to the eye of man and beast. Sunny rays of light, flecked with dust and flying insects, slanted down from the overhanging brown-limbed, green-massed foliage. Roar of wind in the distant forest alternated with soft breeze close at hand. Small dove-gray squirrels ran all over the woodland, very curious about Jean and his dog, rustling the twigs, scratching the barks of trees, chattering and barking, frisky, saucy, and bright-eyed. A plaintive twitter of wild canaries came from the region above the tree-tops. First voices of birds in their pilgrimage toward the south. Pine cones dropped with soft thuds. The blue jays followed these intruders in the forest, screeching their displeasure. Like rain pattered the dropping seeds from the spruce. A woody, earthy, leafy fragrance, damp with the current of life, mingled with a cool, dry, sweet smell of withered grass and rotting pines. Solitude and lonesomeness, peace and rest, wild life and nature reigned there. It was a golden green region, enchanting to the gaze of man. An Indian would have walked there with his spirits. And even as Jean felt all this elevating beauty and inscrutable spirit, his keen eye once more fastened upon the blood-red drops Queen had again left on the gray moss and rock. His wound had reopened. Jean felt the thrill of the scenting panther. The sun set. Twilight gathered. Night fell. Jean crawled under a dense, low-spreading spruce, ate some bread and meat, fed the dog, and lay down to rest and sleep. His thoughts burdened him, heavy and black as the mantle of night. A wolf mourned a hungry cry for a mate. Shep quivered under Jean's hand. That was the call which had lured him from the ranch. The wolf blood in him yearned for the wild. Jean tied the cowhide leash to his wrist. When this dark business was at an end, Shep could be free to join the lonely mate mourning out there in the forest. Then Jean slept. Dawn broke, cold, clear, frosty, with silvered grass sparkling, with a soft, faint rustling of fallen aspen leaves. When the sun rose red, Jean was again on the trail of Queen. By a frosty, ferned brook, where water tinkled and ran clear as air and cold as ice, Jean quenched his thirst, leaning on a stone that showed drops of blood. Queen, too, had quenched his thirst. What good, what help, Jean wondered, could the cold, sweet granite water, so dear to woodsmen and wild creatures, do this wounded, hunted rustler? Why did he not wait in the open to fight and face the death he had meted? Where was that splendid and terrible daring of the gunman? Queen's love of life dragged him on and on, hour by hour, through the pine groves and spruce woods, through the oak swales and aspen glades, up and down the rocky gorges, and around the windfalls and over the rotting logs. The time came when Queen tried no more ambush. He gave up trying to trap his pursuer by lying in wait. He gave up trying to conceal his tracks. He grew stronger, or, in desperation, increased his energy so that he redoubled his progress through the wilderness, that at best would count only a few miles a day. And he began to circle to the northwest, back toward the deep canyon where Blaisdell and Bill Isbel had reached the end of their trails. Queen had evidently left his comrades. He had lone-handed it in his last fight, but he was now trying to get back to them. Somewhere in these wild, deep forest breaks, the rest of the Jorth faction had found a hiding place. Jean let Queen lead him there. Ellen Jorth would be with them. Jean had seen her. It had been his shot that killed Colter's horse, and he had withheld further fire because Colter had dragged the girl behind him, protecting his body with hers. Sooner or later Jean would come upon their camp. She would be there. The thought of her dark beauty, wasted in wantonness upon these rustlers, added a deadly rage to the blood lust and righteous wrath of his vengeance. Let her again flaunt her degradation in his face, and, by the God she had forsaken, he would kill her, and so end the race of Jorths. Another night fell, dark and cold, without starlight. The wind moaned in the forest. Shep was restless. He sniffed the air. There was a step on his trail. Again a mournful, eager, wild, and hungry wolf cry broke the silence. It was deep and low, like that of a baying hound, but infinitely wilder. Shep strained to get away. During the night, while Jean slept, he managed to chew the cowhide leash apart and run off. Next day no dog was needed to trail Queen. Fog and low-drifting clouds in the forest and a misty rain had put the rustler off his bearings. He was lost, and showed that he realized it. Strange how a mature man, fighter of 100 battles, steeped in bloodshed and on his last stand, should grow panic-stricken upon being lost. So Jean Isbel read the signs of the trail. Queen circled and wandered through the foggy, dripping forest until he headed down into a canyon. It was one that notched the rim and led down and down, mile after mile, into the basin. Not soon had Queen discovered his mistake. When he did do so, night overtook him. The weather cleared before morning. Red and bright the sun burst out of the east to flood that low basin land with light. Jean found that Queen had traveled on, hoping, no doubt, to regain what he had lost. But in the darkness he had climbed to the manzanita slopes instead of back up the canyon, and here he had fought the hold of that strange brush of Spanish name until he fell exhausted. Surely Queen would make a stand and wait somewhere in this devilish thicket for Jean to catch up with him. Many and many a place Jean would have chosen had he been in Queen's place. Many a rock and dense thicket Jean circled or approached with extreme care. Manzanita grew in patches that were impenetrable except for a small animal. The brush was a few feet high, seldom so high that Jean could not look over it, and of a beautiful appearance, having glossy, small leaves, a golden berry, and branches of dark red color. These branches were tough and unbendable. Every bush, almost, had low branches that were dead, hard as steel, sharp as thorns, as clutching as cactus. Progress was possible only by endless detours to find the half-closed aisle between patches, or else by crashing through with main strength or walking right over the tops. Jean preferred this last method, not because it was the easiest, but for the reason that he could see ahead so much farther. So he literally walked across the tips of the manzanita brush. Often he fell through and had to step up again. Many a branch broke with him, letting him down, but for the most part he stepped from fork to fork, on branch after branch, with balance of an Indian and the patience of a man whose purpose was sustaining and immutable. On that south slope under the rim the sun beat down hot. There was no breeze to temper the dry air, and before midday Jean was laboring, wet with sweat, parching with thirst, dusty and hot and tiring. It amazed him, the doggedness and tenacity of life shown by this wounded rustler. The time came when under the burning rays of the sun he was compelled to abandon the walk across the tips of the manzanita bushes and take to the winding open threads that ran between. It would have been poor sight indeed that he could not have followed Queen's labyrinthine and broken passage through the brush. Then the time came when Jean espied Queen far ahead and above, crawling like a black bug along the bright green slope. Sight then acted upon Jean as upon a hound in the chase, but he governed his actions if he could not govern his instincts. Slowly but surely he followed the dusty hot trail, and never a patch of blood failed to send a thrill along his veins. Queen headed up toward the rim, finally vanished from sight. Had he fallen? Was he hiding? But the hour disclosed that he was crawling. Jean's keen eye caught the slow moving of the brush and enabled him to keep just so close to the rustler out of the range of the 6-shooters he carried. And so all the interminable hours of the hot afternoon that snail-paced flight and pursuit kept on. Halfway up the rim the growth of manzanita gave place to open, yellow, rocky slope dotted with cedars. Queen took to a slow ascending ridge and left his bloody tracks all the way to the top, where in the gathering darkness the weary pursuer lost them. Another night passed. Daylight was relentless to the rustler. He could not hide his trail, but somehow, in a desperate last rally of strength, he reached a point on the heavily timbered ridge that Jean recognized as being near the scene of the fight in the canyon. Queen was nearing the rendezvous of the rustlers. Jean crossed tracks of horses, and then more tracks that he was certain had been made days past by his own party. To the left of this ridge must be the deep canyon that had frustrated his efforts to catch up with the rustlers on the day Blaisdell lost his life, and probably Bill Isbel, too. Something warned Jean that he was nearing the end of the trail, and an unaccountable sense of imminent catastrophe seemed foreshadowed by vague dreads and doubts in his gloomy mind. Jean felt the need of rest, of food, of ease from the strain of the last weeks, but his spirit drove him implacably. Queen's rally of strength ended at the edge of an open bald ridge that was bare of brush or grass and was surrounded by a line of forest on 3 sides, and on the fourth by a low bluff which raised its gray head above the pines. Across this dusty open Queen had crawled, leaving unmistakable signs of his condition. Jean took long survey of the circle of trees and of the low rocky eminence, neither of which he liked. It might be wiser to keep the cover, Jean thought, and work around to where Queen's trail entered the forest again. But he was tired, gloomy, and his eternal vigilance was failing. Nevertheless, he stilled for the 1000th time that bold prompting of his vengeance, and, taking to the edge of the forest, he went to considerable pains to circle the open ground. And suddenly sight of a man sitting back against a tree halted Jean. He stared to make sure his eyes did not deceive him. Many times stumps and snags and rocks had taken on strange resemblance to a standing or crouching man. This was only another suggestive blunder of the mind behind his eyes. What he wanted to see, he imagined he saw. Jean glided from tree to tree, until he made sure that this sitting image indeed was that of a man. He sat bolt upright, facing back across the open, hands resting on his knees, and closer scrutiny showed Jean that he held a gun in each hand. Queen! At last his nerve had revived. He could not crawl any farther. He could never escape, so with the courage of fatality he chose the open to face his foe and die. Jean had a thrill of admiration for the rustler. Then he stalked out from under the pines and strode forward with his rifle ready. A watching man could not have failed to espy Jean, but Queen never made the slightest move. Moreover, his stiff, unnatural position struck Jean so singularly that he halted with a muttered exclamation. He was now about 50 paces from Queen, within range of those small guns. Jean called sharply, "Queen!" Still the figure never relaxed in the slightest. Jean advanced a few more paces, rifle up, ready to fire the instant Queen lifted a gun. The man's immobility brought the cold sweat to Jean's brow. He stopped to bend the full intense power of his gaze upon this inert figure. Suddenly over Jean flashed its meaning. Queen was dead. He had backed up against a pine ready to face his foe, and he had died there. Not a shadow of a doubt entered Jean's mind as he started forward again. He knew. After all, Queen's blood would not be on his hands. Gordon and Fredericks in their death throes had given the rustler mortal wounds. Jean kept on, marveling the while how ghastly, thin, and hard. Those 4 days of flight had been hell for Queen. Jean reached him, looked down with staring eyes. The guns were tied to his hands. Jean started violently as the whole direction of his mind shifted. A lightning glance showed that Queen had been propped against a tree. Another showed boot tracks in the dust. "By heaven, they fooled me," hissed Jean, and quickly as he leaped behind the pine, he was not quick enough to escape the cunning rustlers who had waylaid him thus. He felt the shock, the bite and burn of lead before he heard a rifle crack. A bullet had ripped through his left forearm. From behind the tree he saw a puff of white smoke along the face of the bluff, the very spot his keen and gloomy vigilance had descried as one of menace. Then several puffs of white smoke and ringing reports betrayed the ambush of the tricksters. Bullets barked the pine and whistled by. Jean saw a man dart from behind a rock and, leaning over, run for another. Jean's swift shot stopped him midway. He fell, got up, and floundered behind a bush scarcely large enough to conceal him. Into that bush Jean shot again and again. He had no pain in his wounded arm, but the sense of the shock clung in his consciousness, and this, with the tremendous surprise of the deceit and sudden release of long-dammed, overmastering passion, caused him to empty the magazine of his Winchester in a terrible haste to kill the man he had hit. These were all the loads he had for his rifle. Blood passion had made him blunder. Jean cursed himself, and his hand moved to his belt. His six-shooter was gone. The sheath had been loose. He had tied the gun fast, but the strings had been torn apart. The rustlers were shooting again. Bullets thudded into the pine and whistled by. Bending carefully, Jean reached one of Queen's guns and jerked it from his hand. The weapon was empty. Both of his guns were empty. Jean peeped out again to get the line in which the bullets were coming, and, marking a course from his position to the cover of the forest, he ran with all his might. He gained the shelter. Shrill yells behind him warned that he had been seen, that his reason for flight had been guessed. Looking back, he saw 2 or 3 men scrambling down the bluff. Then the loud neigh of a frightened horse pealed out. End of chapter 13, part 1. Section 26 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Part 2. Jean discarded his useless rifle and headed down the ridge slope, keeping to the thickest line of pines and sheering around the clumps of spruce. As he ran, his mind whirled with grim thoughts of escape, of his necessity to find the camp where Gordon and Fredericks were buried, there to procure another rifle and ammunition. He felt the wet blood dripping down his arm, yet no pain. The forest was too open for good cover. He dared not run uphill. His only course was ahead, and that soon ended in an abrupt declivity too precipitous to descend. As he halted, panting for breath, he heard the ring of hoofs on stone. Then the thudding beat of running horses on soft ground. The rustlers had sighted the direction he had taken. Jean did not waste time to look. Indeed, there was no need, for as he bounded along the cliff to the right, a rifle cracked and a bullet whizzed over his head. It lent wings to his feet. Like a deer he sped along, leaping cracks and logs and rocks, his ears filled by the rush of wind, until his eye caught sight of thick-growing spruce foliage close to the precipice. He sprang down into the green mass. His weight precipitated him through the upper branches, but lower down his spread arms broke his fall, then retarded it until he caught. A long swaying limb led him down and down, where he grasped another and a stiffer one that held his weight. Hand over hand he worked toward the trunk of this spruce, and gaining it, he found other branches close together, down which he hastened, hold by hold and step by step, until above him was black, dense foliage, and beneath him the brown, shady slope. Sure of being unseen from above, he glided noiselessly down under the trees, slowly regaining freedom from that constriction of his breast. Passing on to a gray lichened cliff, overhanging and gloomy, he paused there to rest and to listen. A faint crack of hoof on stone came to him from above, apparently farther on to the right. Eventually his pursuers would discover that he had taken to the canyon, but for the moment he felt safe. The wound in his forearm drew his attention. The bullet had gone clear through without breaking either bone. His shirt sleeve was soaked with blood. Jean rolled it back and tightly wrapped his scarf around the wound. Yet still the dark red blood oozed out and dripped down into his hand. He became aware of a dull, throbbing pain. Not much time did Jean waste in arriving at what was best to do. For the time being he had escaped, and whatever had been his peril, it was past. In dense, rugged country like this he could not be caught by rustlers. But he had only a knife left for a weapon, and there was very little meat in the pocket of his coat. Salt and matches he possessed. Therefore, the imperative need was for him to find the last camp, where he could get rifle and ammunition, bake bread, and rest up before taking again the trail of the rustlers. He had reason to believe that this canyon was the one where the fight on the rim, and later on a bench of woodland below, had taken place. Thereupon he arose and glided down under the spruces toward the level, grassy open he could see between the trees. And as he proceeded with the slow step and wary eye of an Indian, his mind was busy. Queen had in his flight unerringly worked in the direction of this canyon until he became lost in the fog, and upon regaining his bearings he had made a wonderful and heroic effort to surmount the manzanita slope and the rim, and to find the rendezvous of his comrades. But he had failed up there on the ridge. In thinking it over, Jean arrived at a conclusion that Queen, finding he could go no farther, had waited, guns in hand, for his pursuer, and he had died in this position. Then, by strange coincidence, his comrades had happened to come across him and recognizing the situation, they had taken the shells from his guns and propped him up with the idea of luring Jean on. They had arranged a cunning trick and ambush which had all but snuffed out the last of the Isbels. Colter probably had been at the bottom of this crafty plan. Since the fight at the Isbel ranch, now seemingly far back in the past, this man Colter had loomed up more and more as a stronger and more dangerous antagonist than either Jorth or Daggs. Before that he had been little known to any of the Isbel faction, and it was Colter now who controlled the remnant of the gang, and who had Ellen Jorth in his possession. The canyon wall above Jean on the right grew more rugged and loftier, and the one on the left began to show wooded slopes and breaks, and at last a wide expanse with a winding willow border on the west and a long, low, pine-dotted bench on the east. It took several moments of study for Jean to recognize the rugged bluff above this bench. Up on that canyon several miles was the site where Queen had surprised Jean and his comrades at their campfire. Somewhere in this vicinity was the hiding place of the rustlers. Thereupon Jean proceeded with the utmost stealth, absolutely certain that he would miss no sound, movement, sign, or anything unnatural to the wild peace of the canyon. And his first sense to register something was his keen smell. Sheep? He was amazed to smell sheep. There must be a flock not far away. Then, from where he glided along under the trees, he saw down to open places in the willow brake and noticed sheep tracks in the dark, muddy bank of the brook. Next he heard faint tinkle of bells, and at length, when he could see farther into the open enlargement of the canyon, his surprised gaze fell upon an immense gray, woolly patch that blotted out acres and acres of grass. Thousands of sheep were grazing there. Jean knew there were several flocks of Jorth's sheep on the mountain, in the care of herders, but he had never thought of them being so far west, more than 20 miles from Chevelon Canyon. His roving eyes could not descry any herders or dogs, but he knew there must be dogs close to that immense flock, and whatever his cunning, he could not hope to elude the scent and sight of shepherd dogs. It would be best to go back the way he had come, wait for darkness, then cross the canyon and climb out, and work around to his objective point. Turning at once, he started to glide back, but almost immediately he was brought stock still and thrilling by the sound of hoofs. Horses were coming in the direction he wished to take. They were close. His swift conclusion was that the men who had pursued him up on the rim had worked down into the canyon. One circling glance showed him that he had no sure covert near at hand. It would not do to risk their passing him there. The border of woodland was narrow and not dense enough for close inspection. He was forced to turn back up the canyon in the hope of soon finding a hiding place or break in the wall where he could climb up. Hugging the base of the wall, he slipped on, passing the point where he had espied the sheep, and gliding on until he was stopped by a bend in the dense line of willows. It sheered to the west there and ran close to the high wall. Jean kept on until he was stooping under a curling border of willow thicket, with branches slim and yellow and masses of green foliage that brushed against the wall. Suddenly he encountered an abrupt corner of rock. He rounded it to discover that it ran at right angles with the one he had just passed. Peering up through the willows, he ascertained that there was a narrow crack in the main wall of the canyon. It had been concealed by willows low down and leaning spruces above. A wild, hidden retreat. Along the base of the wall there were tracks of small animals. The place was odorous, like all dense thickets, but it was not dry. Water ran through there somewhere. Jean drew easier breath. All sounds except the rustling of birds or mice in the willows had ceased. The brake was pervaded by a dreary emptiness. Jean decided to steal on a little farther, then wait till he felt he might safely dare go back. The golden green gloom suddenly brightened. Light showed ahead, and parting the willows, he looked out into a narrow, winding canyon, with an open, grassy, willow-streaked lane in the center, and on each side a thin strip of woodland. His surprise was short-lived. A crashing of horses back of him in the willows gave him a shock. He ran out along the base of the wall, back of the trees. Like the strip of woodland in the main canyon, this one was scant and had but little underbrush. There were young spruces growing with thick branches clear to the grass, and under these he could have concealed himself. But with the certainty of sheep-dogs in the vicinity, he would not think of hiding except as a last resource. These horsemen, whoever they were likely to be sheep herders as not. Jean slackened his pace to look back. He could not see any moving objects, but he still heard horses, though not so close now. Ahead of him, this narrow gorge opened out like the neck of a bottle. He would run on to the head of it and find a place to climb to the top. Hurried and anxious as Jean was, he received an impression of singular wild nature of this side gorge. It was a hidden, pine-fringed crack in the rock-ribbed and canyon-cut tableland. Above him the sky seemed a winding stream of blue. The walls were red and bulged out in spruce-greened shelves. From wall to wall was scarcely a distance of 100 feet. Jumbles of rocks obstructed his close holding to the wall. He had to walk at the edge of the timber. As he progressed, the gorge widened into wilder, ruggeder aspect. Through the trees ahead he saw where the wall circled to meet the cliff on the left, forming an oval depression, the nature of which he could not ascertain, but it appeared to be a small opening surrounded by dense thickets and the overhanging walls. Anxiety augmented to alarm. He might not be able to find a place to scale those rough cliffs. Breathing hard, Jean halted again. The situation was growing critical again. His physical condition was worse. Loss of sleep and rest, lack of food, the long pursuit of Queen, the wound in his arm, and the desperate run for his life, these had weakened him to the extent that if he undertook any strenuous effort he would fail. His cunning weighed all chances. The shade of wall and foliage above, and another jumble of ruined cliff hindered his survey of the ground ahead, and he almost stumbled upon a cabin hidden on 3 sides, with a small bare clearing in front. It was an old ramshackle structure like others he had run across in the canyons. Cautiously he approached and peeped around the corner. At first swift glance it had all the appearance of long disuse. But Jean had no time for another look. A clip-clop of trotting horses on hard ground brought the same pell-mell rush of sensations that had driven him to wild flight scarcely an hour past. His body jerked with its instinctive impulse, then quivered with his restraint. To turn back would be risky, to run ahead would be fatal. To hide was his one hope. No covert behind, and the clip-clop of hoofs sounded closer. One moment longer Jean held mastery over his instincts of self-preservation. To keep from running was almost impossible. It was the sheer primitive animal sense to escape. He drove it back and glided along the front of the cabin. Here he saw the cabin adjoined another. Reaching the door, he was about to peep in when the thud of hoofs and voices close at hand transfixed him with a grim certainty that he had not an instant to lose. Through the thin, black-streaked line of trees he saw moving red objects. Horses. He must run. Passing the door, his keen nose caught a musty, woody odor, and the tail of his eye saw a bare dirt floor. The cabin was unused. He halted, gave a quick look back, and the first thing his eye fell upon was a ladder, right inside the door, against the wall. He looked up. It led to a loft that, dark and gloomy, stretched halfway across the cabin. An irresistible impulse drove Jean. Slipping inside, He climbed up the ladder to the loft. It was like night up there. But he crawled on the rough-hewn rafters, and, turning with his head toward the opening, he stretched out and lay still. What seemed an interminable moment ended with a trample of hoofs outside the cabin. It ceased. Jean's vibrating ear caught the jingle of spurs and a thud of boots striking the ground. "Well, sweetheart, here we are home again," drawled a slow, cool, mocking Texas voice. "Home? I wonder, Colter, did you ever have a home, a mother, a sister, much less a sweetheart?" was the reply, bitter and caustic. Jean's palpitating, hot body suddenly stretched still and cold with intensity of shock. His very bones seemed to quiver and stiffen into ice. During the instant of realization his heart stopped, and a slow contracting pressure enveloped his breast and moved up to constrict his throat. That woman's voice belonged to Ellen Jorth. The sound of it had lingered in his dreams. He had stumbled upon the rendezvous of the Jorth faction. Hard indeed had been the fates meted out to those of the Isbels and Jorths who had passed to their deaths. But no ordeal, not even Queen's, could compare with this desperate one Jean must endure. He had loved Ellen Jorth strangely, wonderfully, and he had scorned repute to believe her good. He had spared her father and her uncle. He had weakened or lost the cause of the Isbels. He loved her now, desperately, deathlessly, knowing from her own lips that she was worthless. Loved her the more because he had felt her terrible shame. And to him, the last of the Isbels, had come the cruelest of dooms. To be caught like a crippled rat in a trap, to be compelled to lie, helpless, wounded, without a gun, to listen and perhaps to see Ellen Jorth enact the very truth of her mocking insinuation. His will, his promise, his creed, his blood must hold him to the stern decree that he should be the last man of the Jorth Isbel war. But could he lie there to hear, to see, when he had a knife and an arm? End of chapter 13, part 2. Section 27 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, Part 1. Then followed the leathery flop of saddles to the soft turf and the stamp of loosened horses. Jean heard a noise at the cabin door, a rustle, and then a knock of something hard against wood. Silently he moved his head to look down through a crack between the rafters. He saw the glint of a rifle leaning against the sill. Then the doorstep was darkened. Ellen Jorth sat down with a long, tired sigh. She took off her sombrero, and the light shone on the rippling dark brown hair hanging in a tangled braid. The curved nape of her neck showed a warm tint of golden tan. She wore a gray blouse, soiled and torn, that clung to her lissom shoulders. "Colter, what are you going to do?" she asked suddenly. Her voice carried something Jean did not remember. It thrilled into the icy fixity of his senses. "We'll stay here," was the response, and it was followed by a clinking step of spurred boot. "Shore I won't stay here," declared Ellen. "It makes me sick when I think of how Uncle Tad died in there alone, helpless, sufferin'. The place seems haunted." "Well, I'll agree that it's tough on you. But what the hell can we do?" A long silence ensued, which Ellen did not break. "Something has come off round here since early mornin'," declared Colter. "Somers and Springer haven't got back. And Antonio's gone. Now, honest, Ellen, didn't you hear rifle shots off somewhere?" "I reckon I did," she responded gloomily. "And which way?" "Sounded to me up on the bluff, back pretty far." "Well, shore that's my idea, and it makes me think hard. You know Somers came across the last camp of the Isbels, and he dug into a grave to find the bodies of Jim Gordon and another man he didn't know. Queen kept good as brag. He braced that Isbel gang and killed those fellars but either him or Jean Isbel went off, leaving bloody tracks. If it was Queen's, you can bet Isbel was after him. And if it was Isbel's tracks, why sure Queen would stick to them. Somers and Springer couldn't follow the trail. They're sure not much good at tracking. But for days they've been riding the woods, hoping to run across Queen. Well, now maybe they run across Isbel instead. And if they did and got away from him, they'll be here sooner or later. If Isbel was too many for them, he'd hunt for my trail. I'm gambling that either Queen or Jean Isbel is dead. I'm hoping it's Isbel. Because if he ain't dead, he's the last of the Isbels, and maybe I'm the last of the Jorth gang. Sure, I'm not hankering to meet the half-breed. That's why I say we'll stay here. This is as good a hiding place as there is in the country. We've grub. There's water and grass. Me stay here with you alone? The tone seemed a contradiction to the apparently accepted sense of her words. Jean held his breath, but he could not still the slowly mounting and accelerating faculties within that were involuntarily rising to meet some strange, nameless import. He felt it. He imagined it would be the catastrophe of Ellen Jorth's calm acceptance of Colter's proposition. But down in Jean's miserable heart lived something that would not die. No mere words could kill it. How poignant the moment of her silence! How terribly he realized that if his intelligence and his emotion had believed her betraying words, his soul had not. But Ellen Jorth did not speak. Her brown head hung thoughtfully. Her supple shoulders sagged a little. "Ellen, what's happened to you?" went on Colter. "All the misery possible to a woman," she replied, dejectedly. "Shore I don't mean that way," he continued, persuasively. "I ain't gainsayin' the hard facts of your life. It's been bad. Your dad was no good. But I mean I can't figure the change in you." "No, I reckon you can't," she said. "Whoever was responsible for your make-up left out a mind, not to say feeling." Colter drawled a low laugh. "Well, have that your own way. But how much longer are you going to be like this here?" "Like what?" she rejoined, sharply. "Well, this standoffishness of yours." "Colter, I told you to let me alone," she said, sullenly. "Shore, and you did that before. But this time you're different, and well, I'm getting tired of it." Here the cool, slow voice of the Texan sounded an inflexibility before absent, a timbre that hinted of illimitable power. Ellen Jorth shrugged her lithe shoulders, and slowly rising, she picked up the little rifle and turned to step into the cabin. "Colter," she said, "fetch my pack and my blankets in here." "Shore," he returned, with good nature. Jean saw Ellen Jorth lay the rifle lengthwise in a chink between two logs, and then slowly turn back to the wall. Jean knew her then, yet did not know her. The brown flash of her face seemed that of an older, graver woman. His strained gaze, like his waiting mind, had expected something, he knew not what. A hardened face, a ghost of beauty, a recklessness, a distorted, bitter, lost expression in keeping with her fortunes. But he had reckoned falsely. She did not look like that. There was incalculable change, but the beauty remained, somehow different. Her red lips were parted, her brooding eyes, looking out straight from under the level, dark brows, seemed sloe black and wonderful with their steady, passionate light. Jean, in his eager, hungry devouring of the beloved face, did not on the first instant grasp the significance of its expression. He was seeing the features that had haunted him, but quickly he interpreted her expression as the somber, hunted look of a woman who would bear no more. Under the torn blouse her full breast heaved. She held her hands clenched at her sides. She was listening, waiting for that jangling, slow step. It came, and with the sound she subtly changed. She was a woman hiding her true feelings. She relaxed, and that strong, dark look of fury seemed to fade back into her eyes. Colter appeared at the door, carrying a roll of blankets and a pack. "Throw them here," she said, "and I reckon you needn't bother coming in." That angered the man. With one long stride he stepped over the door sill, down into the cabin, and flung the blankets at her feet and then the pack after it. Whereupon he deliberately sat down in the door facing her. With one hand he slid off his sombrero, which fell outside, and with the other he reached into his upper vest pocket for the little bag of tobacco that showed there. All the time he looked at her. By the light now unobstructed, Jean descried Colter's face, and the sight of it then sounded the roll and drum of his passions. "Well, Ellen, I reckon we'll have it out right now and here," he said, and with tobacco in one hand, paper in the other, he began the operations of making a cigarette. However, he scarcely removed his glance from her. "Yes?" queried Ellen Jorth. "I'm going to have things the way they were before, and more," he declared. The cigarette paper shook in his fingers. "What do you mean?" she demanded. "You know what I mean," he retorted. Voice and action were subtly unhinging this man's control over himself. "Maybe I don't. I reckon you'd better talk plain." The rustler had clear, gray yellow eyes, flawless, like crystal, and suddenly they danced with little fiery flecks. "The last time I laid my hand on you I got hit for my pains, an' shore that been ranklin'." "Colter, you'll get hit again if you put your hands on me," she said, dark, straight glance on him. A frown wrinkled the level brows. "You mean that?" he asked thickly. "I shore do." Manifestly he accepted her assertion. Something of the incredulity and bewilderment that had vied with his resentment utterly disappeared from his face. "Here I've been waitin' for you to love me," he declared, with a gesture not without dignified emotion. "Your givin' in without that wasn't so much to me." And at these words of the rustler's, Jean Isbel felt an icy, sickening shudder creep into his soul. He shut his eyes. The end of his dream had been long in coming, but at last it had arrived. A mocking voice, like a hollow wind, echoed through that region, that lonely and ghost-like hall of his heart which had harbored faith. She burst into speech, louder and sharper, the first words of which Jean's strangely throbbing ears did not distinguish. "You? I never gave in to you, and I never will." "But, girl, I kissed you, hugged you, handled you," he expostulated, and the making of the cigarette ceased. "Yes, you did, you brute, when I was so downhearted and weak I couldn't lift my hand," she flashed. "Ah, you mean I couldn't do that now?" "I should smile I do, Jim Colter," she replied. "Wal, maybe I see presently," he went on, straining with words. "But I'm sure curious. Daggs, then, he was nothin' to you?" "No more than you," she said, morbidly. "He used to run after me long ago, it seems. I was only a girl then, innocent, and I'd not known any but rough men. I couldn't all the time, every day, every hour, keep him at arm's length. Sometimes before I knew I didn't care. I was a child. A kiss meant nothing to me. But after I knew..." Ellen dropped her head in brooding silence. "So do you expect me to believe that?" he queried, with a derisive leer. "Bah! What do I care what you believe?" she cried, with lifting head. "How about Sim Bruce?" "That coyote? He lied about me, Jim Colter. And any man half a man would have known he lied." "Wal, Sim always bragged about you being his girl," asserted Colter. "And he wasn't over particular about details of your love making." Ellen gazed out of the door, over Colter's head, as if the forest out there was a refuge. She evidently sensed more about the man than appeared in his slow talk, in his slouching position. Her lips shut in a firm line, as if to hide their trembling and to still her passionate tongue. Jean, in his absorption, magnified his perceptions. Not yet was Ellen Jorth afraid of this man, but she feared the situation. Jean's heart was at bursting pitch. All within him seemed chaos. a wreck of beliefs and convictions. Nothing was true. He would wake presently out of a nightmare. Yet, as surely as he quivered there, he felt the imminence of a great moment, a lightning flash, a thunderbolt, a balance struck. Colter attended to the forgotten cigarette. He rolled it, lighted it, all the time with lowered, pondering head. And when he had puffed a cloud of smoke, he suddenly looked up with face as hard as flint, eyes as fiery as molten steel. "Well, Ellen, how about Jean Isbel, our half-breed Nez Perce friend, who was sure seen handlin' you familiar?" he drawled. Ellen Jorth quivered as under a lash. Her brown face turned a dusty scarlet that, slowly receding, left her pale. "Damn you, Jim Colter!" she burst out furiously. "I wish Jean Isbel would jump in that door or down out of that loft. He killed Greaves for defiling my name. He'd kill you for your dirty insult. An' I'd like to watch him do it, you cold-blooded Texan, you thievin' rustler, you liar! You lied about my father's death, an' I know why. You stole my father's gold. An' now you want me. You expect me to fall into your arms. My Heaven, can't you tell a decent woman? Was your mother decent? Was your sister decent? Bah, I'm appealing to deafness. But you hear this, Jim Colter. I'm not what you think I am. I'm not the damned hussy you liars have made me out. I'm a Jorth, a lass. I've no home, no relatives, no friends. I've been forced to live my life with rustlers, vile men like you and Daggs and the rest of your like. But I've been good. Do you hear that? I am good. So help me God, and you and all your rottenness can't make me bad." Colter lounged to his tall height, and the laxity of the man vanished. Vanished also was Jean Isbel's suspended icy dread. The cold clogging of his fevered mind vanished in a white, living, leaping flame. Silently he drew his knife and lay there watching with eyes of a wildcat. The instant Colter stepped far enough over toward the edge of the loft, Jean meant to bound erect and plunge down upon him. But Jean could wait now. Colter had a gun at his hip. He must never have a chance to draw it. "And so you wish Jean Isbel would hop in here, do you?" queried Colter. "Well, if I had any pity on you, that's done for it." A sweep of his long arm, so swift Ellen had no time to move, brought his hand in clutching contact with her. And the force of it flung her half across the cabin room, leaving the sleeve of her blouse in his grasp. Panting, she put out that bared arm and her other to ward him off as he took long, slow strides toward her. Jean rose half to his feet, dragged almost by ungovernable passion to risk all in one leap. But the distance was too great. Colter, blind as he was to all outward things, would hear, would see in time to make Jean's effort futile. Shaking like a leaf, Jean sank back, eye again to the crack between the rafters. Ellen did not retreat, nor scream, nor move. Every line of her body was instinct with fight, and the magnificent blaze of her eyes would have checked a less callous brute. Colter's big hand darted between Ellen's arms and fastened in the front of her blouse. He did not try to hold her or draw her close. The unleashed passion of the man required violence. In one savage pull he tore off her blouse, exposing her white, rounded shoulders and heaving bosom, where instantly a wave of red burned upward. Overcome by the tremendous violence and spirit of the rustler, Ellen sank to her knees with blanched face and dilating eyes, trying with folded arms and trembling hand to hide her nudity. At that moment the rapid beat of hoofs on the hard trail outside halted Colter in his tracks. "Hell!" he exclaimed. "And who's that?" With a fierce action he flung the remnants of Ellen's blouse in her face and turned to leap out the door. Jean saw Ellen catch the blouse and try to wrap it around her, while she sagged against the wall and stared at the door. The hoofbeats pounded to a solid, thumping halt just outside. "Jim, there's hell to pay," rasped out a panting voice. "Well, Springer, "I reckon I wish you paid it without spoilin' my deals," reported Colter, cool and sharp. "Deals, huh? You'll be forgettin' your lady love in a minute," replied Springer, "when I catch my breath." "Where's Somers?" demanded Colter. "I reckon he's all shot up, if my eyes didn't fool me." "Where is he?" yelled Colter. "Jim, he's lyin' up in the bushes round that bluff. I didn't wait to see how he was hurt. But he shore stopped some lead, an' he flopped like a chicken with its head cut off." "Where's Antonio?" "He run like the greaser he is," declared Springer, disgustedly. "Ah! An' where's Queen?" queried Colter, after a significant pause. "Dead." End of chapter 14, part 1. Section 28 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, part 2. The silence ensuing was fraught with a suspense that held Jean in cold bonds. He saw the girl below rise from her knees, one hand holding the blouse to her breast, the other extended, and with strange, repressed, almost frantic look she swayed toward the door. "Well, talk," ordered Colter harshly. "Jim, there ain't a hell of a lot," replied Springer, drawing a deep breath, "but what there is shore interestin'. Me an' Somers took Antonio with us. He left his woman with the sheep. An' we rode up the canyon, clumb out on top, an' made a circle back on the ridge. That's the way we've been huntin' for tracks. Up there in a bare spot we run plumb into Queen sittin' against a tree right out in the open. Queerest sight you ever seen. The damn gunfighter had set down to wait for Isbel, who was trailin' him, as we suspected, an' he died there. He wasn't cold when we found him. Somers was quick to see a trick, so he propped Queen up an' tied the guns to his hands. An', Jim, the queerest thing about that deal was this. Queen's guns was empty, not a shell left. It beat us holler. We left him there an' hid up high on the bluff, maybe 100 yards off. The horses we left back of a thicket. An' we waited there for a long time. But sure enough the half breed come. He was too smart, too much Injun. He would not cross the open, but went around. An' then he seen Queen. It was great to watch him. After a little he shoved his rifle out and went right for Queen. This is when I wanted to shoot. I could have plugged him, but Somers says wait and make it sure. When Isbel got up to Queen he was sort of half hid by a tree. I couldn't wait no longer, so I shot. I hit him, too. We all begun to shoot. Somers showed himself, and that's when Isbel opened up. He used up a whole magazine on Somers, and then, sudden like, he quit. It didn't take me long to figure maybe he was out of shells. When I seen him run I was certain of it. Then we made for the horses and rode after Isbel. Pretty soon I seen him running like a deer down the ridge. I yelled and spurred after him. There's where Antonio quit me. But I kept on, and I got a shot at Isbel. He ran out of sight. I followed him by spots of blood on the stones and grass until I couldn't trail him no more. He must have gone down over the cliffs. He couldn't have done nothing else without me seeing him. I found his rifle, and here it is to prove what I say. I had to go back to climb down off the rim, and I rode fast down the canyon. He's somewhere along that west wall, hiding in the brush. Hard hit, if I know anything about the color of blood." "Wal, that beats me holler too," ejaculated Colter. "Jim, what's to be done?" inquired Springer eagerly. "If we're sharp we can corral that half breed. He's the last of the Isbels." "More, pard. He's the last of the Isbel outfit," declared Colter. "If you can show me blood in his tracks I'll trail him." "You can bet I'll show you," rejoined the other rustler. "But listen, wouldn't it be better for us first to see if he crossed the canyon? I reckon he didn't, but let's make sure. And if he didn't, we'll have him somewhere along the West Canyon wall. He's not got no gun. He'll never run that way if he had. Jim, he's our meat." "Shore he'll have that knife," pondered Colter. "We needn't worry about that," said the other, positively. "He's hard hit, I tell you. All we got to do is find that bloody trail again an' stick to it, goin' careful. He's layin' low like a crippled wolf." "Springer, I want the job of finishin' that half breed," hissed Colter. "I'll give 10 years of my life to stick a gun down his throat an' shoot it off." "All right, let's rustle. Maybe you'll not have to give much more'n 10 minutes, because I tell you I can find him. It's been easy, but Jim, I reckon I was afraid." "Leave your horse for me an' go ahead," the rustler then said, brusquely. "I've got a job in the cabin here." "Haw haw. Wal, Jim, I'll rustle a bit down the trail an' wait. No huntin' Jean Isbel alone, not for me. I've had a queer feelin' about that knife he used on Greaves, an' I reckon you ought to let that Jorth hussy alone long enough to Springer, I reckon I've got the hog tie her." His voice became indistinguishable, and footsteps attested to a slow moving away of the men. Jean had listened with ears acutely strung to catch every syllable, while his gaze rested upon Ellen, who stood beside the door. Every line of her body denoted a listening intensity. Her back was toward Jean, so that he could not see her face. And he did not want to see, but he could not help seeing her naked shoulders. She put her head out of the door. Suddenly she drew it in quickly and half turned her face, slowly raising her white arm. This was the left one and bore the mark of Colter's hard fingers. She gave a little gasp. Her eyes became large and staring. They were bent on the hand that she had removed from a step on the ladder. On hand and wrist showed a bright red smear of blood. Jean, with a convulsive leap of his heart, realized that he had left his bloody tracks on the ladder as he had climbed. That moment seemed the supremely terrible one of his life. Ellen Jorth's face blanched and her eyes darkened and dilated with exceeding amaze and flashing thought to become fixed with horror. That instant was the one in which her reason connected the blood on the ladder with the escape of Jean Isbel. One moment she leaned there, still as a stone except for her heaving breast, and then her fixed gaze changed to a swift, dark blaze, comprehending yet inscrutable, as she flashed it up the ladder to the loft. She could see nothing, yet she knew, and Jean knew that she knew, he was there. A marvelous transformation passed over her features and even over her form. Jean choked with the ache in his throat. Slowly she put the bloody hand behind her, while with the other she still held the torn blouse to her breast. Colter's slouching musical step sounded outside, and it might have been a strange breath of infinitely vitalizing and passionate life blown into the well springs of Ellen Jorth's being. Isbel had no name for her then. The spirit of a woman had been to him a thing unknown. She swayed back from the door against the wall in singular softened poise, as if all the steel had melted out of her body. And as Colter's tall shadow fell across the threshold, Jean Isbel felt himself staring with eyeballs that ached, straining incredulous sight at this woman who in a few seconds had bewildered his senses with her transfiguration. He saw, but could not comprehend. "Jim, I heard all Springer told you," she said. The look of her dumbfounded Colter, and her voice seemed to shake him visibly. "Suppose you did. What then?" he demanded, harshly, as he halted with one booted foot over the threshold. Malignant and forceful, he eyed her darkly, doubtfully. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "What, of me?" "No, of Jean Isbel. He might kill you and then where would I be?" "Wal, I'm damned!" ejaculated the rustler. "What's got into you?" He moved to enter, but a sort of fascination bound him. "Jim, I hated you a moment ago," she burst out. "But now, with that Jean Isbel somewhere near, hidin', watchin' to kill you an' maybe me too, I don't hate you any more. Take me away." "Girl, have you lost your nerve?" he demanded. "My God, Colter, can't you see?" she implored. "Won't you take me away?" "I shore will presently," he replied, grimly. "But you'll wait till I've shot the lights out of this Isbel." "No!" she cried. "Take me away now and I'll give in. I'll be what you want. You can do with me as you like." Colter's lofty frame leaped, as if at the release of bursting blood. With a lunge he cleared the threshold to loom over her. "Am I out of my head or are you?" he asked, in low, hoarse voice. His darkly corded face expressed extreme amaze. "Jim, I mean it," she whispered, edging an inch nearer him, her white face uplifted, her dark eyes unreadable in their eloquence and mystery. "I've no friend but you. I'll be yours. I'm lost. What does it matter? If you want me, take me now before I kill myself." "Ellen Jorth, there's something wrong about you," he responded. "Did you tell the truth when you denied ever being a sweetheart of Simm Bruce?" "Yes, I told you the truth." "Ahuh! And how do you account for laying me out with every dirty name you could give tongue to?" "Oh, it was temper. I wanted to be let alone." "Temper? Well, I reckon you've got one," he retorted, grimly. "And I'm not shore you're not crazy or lying. An hour ago I couldn't touch you." "You may now, if you promise to take me away at once. This place has got on my nerves. I couldn't sleep here with that Isbel hiding round. Could you?" "Wal, I reckon I'd not sleep very deep." "Then let us go." He shook his lean, eagle like head in slow, doubtful vehemence, and his piercing gaze studied her distrustfully. Yet all the while there was manifest in his strung frame an almost irrepressible violence held in abeyance to his will. "That about your being so good?" he inquired, with a return of the mocking drawl. "Never mind what's past," she flashed, with passion dark as his. "I've made my offer." "Shore there's a lie about you somewhere," he muttered, thickly. "Man, could I do more?" she demanded, in scorn. "No, but it's a lie," he returned. "You'll get me to take you away and then fool me, run off God knows what. Women are all liars." Manifestly he could not believe in her strange transformation. Memory of her wild, passionate denunciation of him and his kind must have seared even his calloused soul. But the ruthless nature of him had not weakened nor softened in the least as to his intentions. This weather vane veering of hers bewildered him, obsessed him with its possibilities. He had the look of a man who was divided between love of her and hate, whose love demanded a return, but whose hate required a proof of her abasement. Not proof of surrender, but proof of her shame. The ignominy of him thirsted for its like. He could grind her beauty under his heel, but he could not soften to this feminine inscrutableness. And whatever was the truth of Ellen Jorth in this moment, beyond Colter's gloomy and stunted intelligence, beyond even the love of Jean Isbel, it was something that held the balance of mastery. She read Colter's mind. She dropped the torn blouse from her hand and stood there, unashamed, with the wave of her white breast pulsing, eyes black as night and full of hell, her face white, tragic, terrible, yet strangely lovely. "Take me away," she whispered, stretching one white arm toward him, then the other. Colter, even as she moved, had leaped with inarticulate cry and radiant face to meet her embrace, but it seemed, just as her left arm flashed up toward his neck, that he saw her bloody hand and wrist. Strange how that checked his ardor, threw up his lean head like that striking bird of prey. "Blood! What the hell!" he ejaculated, and in one sweep he grasped her. "How'd you do that? Are you cut? Hold still." Ellen could not release her hand. "I scratched myself," she said. "Where? All that blood?" And suddenly he flung her hand back with fierce gesture, and the gleams of his yellow eyes were like the points of leaping flames. They pierced her, read the secret falsity of her. Slowly he stepped backward, guardedly. His hand moved to his gun, and his glance circled and swept the interior of the cabin. As if he had a nose of a hound in sight to follow scent, his eyes bent to the dust of the ground before the door. He quivered, grew rigid as stone, and then moved his head with exceeding slowness, as if searching through a microscope in the dust. Farther to the left, to the foot of the ladder, and up one step, another, a third, all the way up to the loft. Then he whipped out his gun and wheeled to face the girl. "Ellen, you've got your half-breed here," he said, with a terrible smile. She neither moved nor spoke. There was a suggestion of collapse, but it was only a change where the alluring softness of her hardened into a strange, rapt glow. And in it seemed the same mastery that had characterized her former aspect. Herein the treachery of her was revealed. She had known what she meant to do in any case. Colter, standing at the door, reached a long arm toward the ladder, where he laid his hand on a rung. Taking it away, he held it palm outward for her to see the dark splotch of blood. "See?" "Yes, I see," she said ringingly. Passion wrenched him, transformed him. All that about leaving here with me, about giving in, was a lie. "No, Colter, it was the truth. I'll go yet, now, if you'll spare him." She whispered the last word, and made a slight movement of her hand toward the loft. "Girl," he exploded incredulously, "you love this half-breed, this Isbel, you love him." "With all my heart. Thank God, it has been my glory. It might have been my salvation. But now I'll go to hell with you if you'll spare him." "Damn my soul!" rasped out the rustler, as if something of respect was wrung from that sordid deep of him. You woman! Jorth will turn over in his grave. He'll rise out of his grave if this Isbel got you." "Hurry, hurry!" implored Ellen. "Springer may come back. I think I heard a call." "Well, Ellen Jorth, I'll not spare Isbel nor you," he returned, with dark and meaning leer, as he turned to ascend the ladder. Jean Isbel, too, had reached the climax of his suspense. Gathering all his muscles in a knot, he prepared to leap upon Colter as he mounted the ladder. But Ellen Jorth screamed piercingly and snatched her rifle from its resting place, and cocking it, she held it forward and low. "Colter!" Her scream and his uttered name stiffened him. "You'll spare Jean Isbel," she rang out. "Drop that gun. Drop it." "Sure, Ellen. Easy now. Remember your temper. I'll let Isbel off." He panted huskily, and all his body sank quiveringly to a crouch. "Drop your gun. Don't turn round, Colter. I'll kill you." But even then he failed to divine the meaning and the spirit of her. "Aw, now, Ellen," he entreated, in louder, huskier tones, as if dragged by fatal doubt of her still, he began to turn. Crash! The rifle emptied its contents into Colter's breast. All his body sprang up. He dropped the gun. Both hands fluttered toward her, and an awful surprise flashed over his face. "So help me God!" he whispered, with blood thick in his voice. Then, darkly, as one groping, he reached for her with shaking hands. You white-throated hussy! I'll..." He grasped the quivering rifle barrel. Crash! She shot him again. As he swayed over her and fell, she had to leap aside, and his clutching hand tore the rifle from her grasp. Then in convulsion he writhed, to heave on his back and stretch out, a ghastly spectacle. Ellen backed away from it, her white arms wide, a slow horror blotting out the passion of her face. Then from without came a shrill call and the sound of rapid footsteps. Ellen leaned against the wall, staring at Colter. "Hey, Jim, what's the shooting?" called Springer, breathlessly. As his form darkened the doorway, Jean once again gathered all his muscular force for a tremendous spring. Springer saw the girl first, and he appeared thunderstruck. His jaw dropped. He needed not the white gleam of her person to transfix him. Her eyes did that, and they were riveted in unutterable horror upon something on the ground. Thus instinctively directed, Springer espied Colter. You've shot him!" he shrieked. "What for, you hussy? Ellen Jorth, if you've killed him, I'll..." He strode toward where Colter lay. Then Jean, rising silently, took a step, and like a tiger he launched himself into the air, down upon the rustler. Even as he leaped, Springer gave a quick upward look, and he cried out. Jean's moccasined feet struck him squarely and sent him staggering into the wall, where his head hit hard. Jean fell, but bounded up as the half-stunned Springer drew his gun. Then Jean lunged forward with a single sweep of his arm and looked no more. Ellen ran swaying out of the door, and once clear of the threshold, she tottered out on the grass to sink to her knees. The bright golden sunlight gleamed upon her white shoulders and arms. Jean had one foot out of the door when he saw her, and he whirled back to get her blouse. But Springer had fallen upon it. Snatching up a blanket, Jean ran out. "Ellen, Ellen, Ellen!" he cried. "It's over!" And reaching her, he tried to wrap her in the blanket. She wildly clutched his knees. Jean was conscious only of her white, agonized face and the dark eyes with their look of terrible strain. Did you?" she whispered. "Yes, it's over," he said gravely. "Ellen, the Isbel Jorth feud is ended." "Oh, thank God!" she cried in breaking voice. "Jean, you're wounded. The blood on the step." "My arm. See, it's not bad. Ellen, let me wrap this round you." Folding the blanket around her shoulders, he held it there and entreated her to get up. But she only clung closer. She hid her face on his knees. Long shudders rippled over her, shaking the blanket, shaking Jean's hands. Distraught, he did not know what to do, and his own heart was bursting. "Ellen, you must not kneel there that way," he implored. "Jean, Jean," she moaned, and clung the tighter. He tried to lift her up, but she was a dead weight, and with that hold on him seemed anchored at his feet. "I killed Colter," she gasped. "I had to kill him. I offered to fling myself away." "For me!" he cried, poignantly. "Oh, Ellen, Ellen, the world has come to an end." "Hush! Don't keep saying that. Of course you killed him. You saved my life, for I'd never have let you go off with him. Yes, you killed him. You're a Jorth and I'm an Isbel. We've blood on our hands, both of us. I for you and you for me." His voice of entreaty and sadness strengthened her, and she raised her white face, loosening her clasp to lean back and look up. Tragic, sweet, despairing, the loveliness of her, the significance of her there on her knees, thrilled him to his soul. "Blood on my hands," she whispered. "Yes, it was awful killing him. But all I care for in this world is for your forgiveness and your faith that saved my soul." "Child, there's nothing to forgive," he responded. "Nothing. Please, Ellen." "I lied to you," she cried. "I lied to you." "Ellen, listen, darling." And the tender epithet brought her head and arms back close pressed to him. "I know now," he faltered on. "I found out today what I believed. And I swear to God, by the memory of my dead mother, down in my heart I never, never believed what you tried to make me believe. Never." "Jean, I love you, love you, love you," she breathed with exquisite, passionate sweetness. Her dark eyes burned up into his. "Ellen, I can't lift you up," he said in trembling eagerness, signifying his crippled arm. "But I can kneel with you." End of Chapter 14, Part 2. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of To the Last Man by Zane Grey.